Chapter 427. Under the sunlight, President Pabre looked at the camera calmly and said, "The code name of this military operation is Victory, because we will definitely achieve the final victory." The Charter Square was filled with jubilation, but there was also solemnity amidst the jubilation. For tens of thousands of years, the humans of the Federation had floated alone in the dark universe. In the colonial galaxies and the newly developed space zones, they did not find any relatives. Gradually, they lost their obsession to find extraterrestrial life. With a hint of sadness and a hint of pride, they confirmed that they were the only crystallization of wisdom in the universe, the leader of all things. However, in the last few years of the last constitutional era, people were shocked to discover that on the other side of the Night Scorpion Nebula, intelligent life that was extremely similar to them actually existed. Although the political systems of the two parties were different, from the perspective of biology and natural selection, the people of the Federation and the people of the Imperium walked on the path of carbon-based life with their heads held high. There was no essential difference at all. Some anthropologists even began to boldly suspect that before the unknown catastrophe, the human societies on the two sides of the universe were vaguely connected. The people of the Federation might not be orphans in the first place. Where did we come from? Was it the same place? They lacked evidence, only sunny and optimistic inferences. Unfortunately, such inferences did not have the time to develop into movies, novels, stage plays, or even the warmth of universal diplomacy before they were directly turned into smoke by the flames of war that year. As a result, what might have been a comedy of distant relatives holding hands and weeping together became a tragedy of flowers and silver trees blooming in the sky and blood flowing on the yellow soil once they met. From the day the flames of war began, the competition between the Federation and the Imperium was painted with a layer of thick, hellish ink by blood and death. No one ever explored the endless stories between the two civilizations that were so similar that it made one's hair stand on end. The negative emotions of anger, sorrow, pain, and darkness, as well as the impassioned words of revenge and resistance flooded into the lives and emotions of all the citizens of the Federation. At this point, the stars shone brightly. There was no other choice but to completely defeat the Imperium. In the words of George Carlin, one of the few people who talked about the Empire, it was that every citizen of the Federation had to be a natural anti-empire. In the last few days of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar, the West Woods border, which had been peaceful on the surface for the past 10 years, started to fight again. The Federation, which had been waiting patiently for 10 years, started to move. Tens of billions of citizens of the Federation were excited, cheering and talking non-stop. After the gathering at Charter Square, the news channels of major TV stations began to mobilize all their resources to report on the biggest event of the decade. On the other hand, the Federation News Channel, which occupied the most authoritative position, had even cancelled all of its routine news programs. Instead, it began to use text, pictures, and video to broadcast live the battle at the border of Ceylon continuously. The Federation mobilized 94 divisions in the early hours of this morning to launch the final general attack on the remaining invaders of the Empire on the 3 planets at the border of the West Woods. With a solemn expression, the female news anchor with delicate features lowered her head slightly. She quickly flipped through the electronic text prompt screen and said at a very fast speed, "According to the latest battle report sent by the Department of Defense, we can now confirm that the main force of this victorious military operation came from the West Woods military region. The one responsible for the interstellar military force transportation is the Federation's Second Fleet." At this time, a video provided by the federal military appeared on the news screen. In the vast and dark universe, a fleet of more than 40 Federation giant warships, which stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers, was heading toward a certain inconspicuous galaxy in the distance. The light of the stars on the right rear shone on the majestic fleet, making the hull of the space warships shine, making the scene look extremely magnificent. The female news anchor held a digital pen in her hand and asked in a sincere and respectful tone, "Professor Lee, President Pabre has declared war on the Empire. According to your calculations, how long will it take for the Federation to complete the first phase of the plan?" Lee Jae-do, the vice dean of the 1st Military Academy, replied with a smile, "The Imperial Expeditionary Force's supply of troops has not been interrupted, but as long as the 2 space channels are in our hands, the first phase of the attack should not be too big of a problem." As the only son of the military god Li Pifu, Li Jiedu had always been taciturn and low-key in the federal military and political circles. The people of the Federation did not know much about him. Originally, he was not willing to appear on the news program, but the Federation government had to ask him to appear in order to explain the war to the people for so long. After all, he was a member of the Lees of Philadelphia, so the people of the Federation would definitely trust him more than the spokesperson of the government. In fact, he knew very well that the image shown on the news was from 10 hours ago. At this time, almost all of the mechanized troops of the West Woods military had probably arrived in the sky above the 2 planets and were in the midst of a forceful landing battle. In the studio, a white-haired war strategist frowned in confusion and asked Director Li, "As far as I know, the fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force has been cautiously wandering around the periphery of the region." "That is the desolate region. The Federation has not been able to obtain an accurate star map. This time, the Second Fleet is cruising at full capacity at high speed. Once that fleet launches a surprise attack, the flames of war in the West Woods region rose again." The military scientists in the Capital Ring were most vigilant and puzzled about why the Department of Defense dared to use the Second Fleet to carry out the full-capacity transportation plan. After all, the Imperial Expeditionary Force fleet that was like a ghost whose location could not be determined was really a big problem. The fleet of the Empire is currently in the 5460 system. Li Jiedu was not used to sitting in front of the camera. He smiled and coughed twice before saying, "But I believe that they will never be able to return to the star system they are familiar with to be ghosts." The news immediately shocked all the staff in the studio and the countless viewers in front of the TV. Director Li Jiedu suddenly remembered the mission that Mr. President had given him and said to the camera, "The goal of the first phase of the plan is to drive the people of the Empire away from the 3 resource star systems. According to the host's question, according to my judgment, it will take the Federal Army at most 1.5 years to complete this historical mission." The female host suddenly opened her eyes wide and asked an extremely unprofessional question that hit the nail on the head. "The military operation is codenamed Victory. Does it have anything to do with the National Girls' Victory Concert? Resource Star System? Did they really want the public to believe that there were only mines and military bases there, but no Federation citizens?" Jian Shui'er looked at Rong Pingjing's cousin on the TV and frowned slightly. A hint of mockery flashed in her eyes. Including 5460, in the 3 star systems that had fallen into the hands of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, there were close to 2 million Federation citizens who had been trapped under the iron hooves of the Empire for several decades. Meanwhile, the Federation government had always ignored them for the sake of the greater strategic arrangements, hiding the truth from the public. However, this was ultimately a decision that the government, parliament, and military had no choice but to make many years ago. This time's Federation government was at least correcting the mistakes that the Federation had made in the past. Doing some propaganda and embellishing was understandable. Jian Shui'er lowered her head slightly as she thought to herself. A moment later, she raised her head and watched the replay of President Pabre's speech on the TV. A trace of a smile appeared on her face. A mature president or politician should announce the start of war before the midterm elections or the next term of office. On one hand, this would increase the chances of success and reduce the risk. On the other hand, it would also help them gain more electoral support. However, President Pabre had ignored the collective opposition of his staff when the new MX Mecha had just been equipped to the army. He had used his superb political skills to unify the opposing views in Parliament and forcefully pushed through the military deployment plan of the Ministry of Defense despite the objections of the masses. This kind of decision might seem a little radical, but hidden within this radical was a certain political philosophy that was worthy of respect. Under Mr. Pabre's tanned and simple face, it was precisely this respectable way of thinking that was completely different from most politicians that allowed him to win the recognition and respect of many Federation youths, such as Tai Ziyuan and Su Lu. Just like many people, Jian Shui'er also greatly admired this Mr. President who had come from a poor background. Because of her family background, she vaguely knew some of the inside story. This Westwoods war plan was completely proposed and single-handedly pushed forward by this charismatic Mr. President. For this matter, the president had even made a special trip to Philadelphia. The TV began to play the second video released by the Ministry of Defense. She carefully watched the federal fleet on the screen as if they were transporting a flock of birds. They used the air-to-ground transport pods to deliver the heavy equipment and soldiers of the landing force to the two unfamiliar planets. Looking at the explosions that continued to erupt from the two planets, the hands hanging by her waist gradually tightened. The national girl Jian Shui'er was the fuse of this war. It was hard to believe, but this was the truth. Furthermore, she was a top student from the 1st Military Academy's Warship Command Department. Her family background allowed her to hide an intelligent military sense under her cute appearance. Seeing this, she roughly understood the federal military's grand plan. She was the bait, and even the Federation's attack in the southern hemisphere of 5460 was just a disguise. From the very beginning, the federal military's plan was to transfer the last fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force to this star sector, and then begin to attack the other two planets with a thunderous force. Those two planets had been completely occupied and operated by the Imperial Expeditionary Force for many years. The situation was completely different from the situation on 5460. In order to tear open a hole in such an environment and establish an outpost for the Federation's counterattack, the Westwoods military region had to complete a sudden landing raid in the shortest time possible. And this, first, they had to transfer the last fleet of the Empire away. A light flashed through Jian Shui'er's ink-like eyes. Her delicate lips opened slightly, and she let out a sigh of admiration. This was a simple military plan. Although it had successfully deceived the people of the Empire and even many of the Federation's participating troops, no matter whether it was the reaction of the Maple Federation, the mobilization of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, or the advance arrival of the Federal Fleet, as long as there was an unexpected situation in one step, this plan could not be carried out. The person who made this plan had calculated all of the Empire's countermeasures without a single mistake. It was a simple and light placement of chess pieces, but it landed in every place where the enemy would definitely advance and retreat. What kind of realm was this? This was a terrifying realm where one had grasped every gust of wind on the battlefield in one's hand and grasped the reactions of people to the extreme. Thus, it appeared to be at their fingertips, at ease, and with great complexity as simple as it was simple. Jian Shui'er thought in surprise. The old man had already retired. Why did he come out of retirement this time? Chapter 428. I'll get straight to the point. I haven't updated today. I'd like to report to everyone that the deposit for the house has been paid today. My supervisor and I both confirmed that the sales lady was really pretty. Then, countless things piled up on me, and I felt like I couldn't handle them all. Like I said the other day, the 1,000 words I forced myself to write just now were even worse than some paragraphs. Although the spies' plots had been on the right track recently, there had been some problems with their rhythm. This was because there was a problem with the rhythm of my life. Like today, it wasn't difficult to squeeze out plots to sell for money. I could always get some word count with a little bit of effort, but that's a fake product. I don't think that's right. So I can only not write. I can't write. It's not that I can't write, it's that I don't want to. Because you have to spend money for these words, and I have to be responsible for my own face. I've never asked for leave, and I've stopped updating twice in a week. It's very annoying, but compared to writing shit, the latter is more annoying. So I sincerely ask for leave. I ask for leave because I can't help it, because I'm too busy to talk about it. I don't dare to promise that I won't ask for leave in the future. After serious self-reflection and calculation, I think that starting in March, the speed of the spy should return to how it was at the beginning. In the next 1.5 months, I'll do my best to write the spy well. In fact, in the outline, this should be the stage I'm most concerned about. I sincerely ask that after tomorrow, although you won't be reading the forbidden book in the snow outside the window, you can still read the spy slower than when it was 3,000 words. Because I want to write more carefully, so that the amount of information and the things you feel will be richer. The spy has been laying the groundwork for the past few days. If it's 6,000 or 9,000 words a day, this kind of groundwork can actually be seen beautifully. But if it's all groundwork for 3,000 words a day, it will only appear dull and clumsy. So I want to spend more effort on the details. I hope that after your reading rhythm is ruined, you can be merciful. After thinking about it seriously again, I still need to adjust the time of the update to the afternoon, so that I can adjust my work state. It's best if I can finish writing in advance every day, then send it out at the right time. That's more appropriate. Tomorrow, I'll write 2 chapters. From the day after tomorrow, I'll try to write 1 chapter every day at 4 p.m. Wind can't blow, rain can't hit. Because I actually like this story. Because the later parts of the story were all interesting and murderous things that I really wanted to write. Please give me and the spy more patience with this story. That invincible, great, and diligent tomcat, who didn't need to take a wedding break and only cared about renovations, would finally tear apart its fur and reveal its brilliance. It would appear in front of your fresh eyes every day in a slow-motion running posture. Although it will be written more slowly, it will definitely be written more straightforwardly, so that we and Sulu can travel in a straight line through the universe, with infinite glory. For the next 2 months, I definitely won't be soliciting monthly votes. I can just do whatever I want with recommendation votes. Anyway, the guests will definitely be good in the future, so I definitely have some confidence in this aspect. 1,000 words on the note should be able to prove that what I said was true. In my opinion, not updating while asking for leave is a sign of responsibility. I am still narcissistic. Bow and leave the stage. See you tomorrow. Chapter 429. Jian Shui'er could be cute and innocent in front of her family, but she could also be youthful, adorable, charming, and witty to the point of being natural. She could make countless members of the opposite sex fall head over heels in love with her and be willing to live a life of poverty for her. This kind of natural ability probably had some kind of indescribable mystery to it. This was the real her, but it was not the entire her. The other part of her was unwilling to use the intelligence and abilities she had developed at First Hospital and her home in Philadelphia to figure out the dangers and complexities of the human world. However, right now, she could not get rid of her doubts. They were like clouds that forever covered the night sky, blocking out the thousands of stars that scattered down from the universe. It made it difficult for her to keep her heart pure and clear even if she wanted to. At this moment, she needed to discuss the heavy and deep doubts in her heart with someone close and trustworthy, and on this planet, there was no doubt that there was only that small-eyed man. After going through a complicated authorization check, she was brought by the female officer to a large warehouse in the depths of the underground base of the spaceport. The national maiden looked at the scene in front of her and covered her slightly gaping mouth in shock. The underground warehouse was very large and spacious. A large black MX mecha of the Federation hung on a platform suspended in midair. The heavily damaged outer shell on the left side of the mecha had already been dismantled, revealing the dizzyingly complex mechanical structure inside. It looked like a human skeleton specimen from a medical school, except that it had a faint metallic glow. Also, because it was too large, it gave off a strong sense of oppression for the people in the warehouse. On the left side of the black MX, a simple automatic assembly line suspended 5 meters in the air was moving in many parts with a clatter. Below the assembly line, 6 officers were recording something with serious expressions on their faces. In their hands, the electronic repair records kept flashing rapidly, recording in detail every movement seen with the naked eye. The dark blue patch on their left shoulders indicated that they were Federation repair officers. One of the officers wiped the sweat off his forehead and looked at the guy on the black mecha who was silently climbing and jumping like an ape. He said in shock, "I always thought that my repair skills were already not bad at all." Sulu stood on the tall mecha. After a night of battle and thousands of miles of travel, even the newest generation MX mecha of the Federation, under the frenzied pursuit of the Empire's Moon Wolf Mecha Brigade, had still ended up riddled with holes in certain areas, with some systems extremely fragile. Sulu believed that the Department of Defense would give him a new dangerous mission. Therefore, after 2 hours of light sleep, he went to the warehouse. He wanted to fix the Black MX in the shortest amount of time possible. Pulling out a very long data cable, he narrowed his eyes as he stood below the black mech. His fingers lightly touched the control panel on the terminal to remove the outer armor of the MX mech. He didn't really care about the gazes of the 6 mech technicians behind him. In truth, those who had the authority to enter this warehouse naturally had the right to get close to the MX mech. Sulu climbed to the platform below the left shoulder of the mech. Reaching out, he pulled out 2 data cables, broke them with force, and connected them to the workbench. Accompanied by the sound of motors, the light silver automatic repair arm rose from the mech. Shang Qiu had made many modifications to this Black MX. In her opinion, all the long-range firepower systems that Sulu needed had been completely removed. However, she had forcefully kept the automatic repair arm installed on the mech. This was because she knew that for a genius mechanic like Sulu, a standardized automatic repair arm was more important than anything else. The light alloy mechanical repair arm was lifted off the roof of the warehouse by a crane. Sulu rubbed his hair, narrowed his eyes, and grunted. Both his hands grabbed the clasp of the repair arm and pressed a button. Bright electric sparks shot out from the top of the mechanical arm. The components that had been prepared beforehand were meticulously placed into the damaged interior of the mech. Then, one by one, they were quickly welded together. At this time, Sulu was wearing a dark green singlet. His muscles, which were usually hidden, were clearly defined because he had to operate the extraordinarily heavy mechanical arm. They were filled with a sense of power that had yet to be unleashed. He wore sunglasses and quickly and accurately carried out the repair work. At the same time, he requested parts from the 6 mechanics below him. Standard loop shock absorber. Number 3 ball joint transmission rod. You don't have it. M52 knee joint transmission rod, please grind it down to a diameter of 3 centimeters. He stood tall on the mech, holding the mechanical repair arm, spitting out sparks. He was like the most courageous warrior of the Federation holding a Darlin rotary machine gun, firing continuously. Every operation he made, every part he requested, would make the 6 Federation mechanics below him tremble violently in their hearts. This was because they had never seen anyone carry out this kind of mechanical repair. Every micro-operation that the young officer on the black mech did was so precise and appropriate. No one would have imagined that one person carrying a heavy repair arm could actually do so much repair work so quickly. Moreover, not a single action was superfluous. What made these mechanics even more fearful and worshipful was that in the beginning, they simply did not understand the intention of Su Li's repair actions. It was not until half a minute later that the embryonic form gradually came together that they more or less understood this kind of exquisite repair train of thought. They could not help but admit that Sulu, who was repairing the Black MX, had long surpassed them in terms of mechanical repair skills. No, he had surpassed the skill level of most of the mechanics in the Federation military by too much. The legend of one person repairing a mech, which was usually unimaginable, seemed to be slowly becoming a reality at this moment. Therefore, that mechanic was so shocked that he could only repeat a certain sentence over and over again. The mechanics beside him also silently felt the same way. One of them stared with his eyes wide and pursed his lips. Looking at Sulu, who had taken out a small knife and was cutting open a certain sealed circuit, he said in shock, "Can this kind of parallel serial circuit be replaced by a triple overlapping circuit? There's no such thing in the textbooks. We don't understand, but that doesn't mean it's impossible." Don't forget, the MX was designed by him in the first place. The voices of the discussions were very soft, but Sulu, who was climbing up and down the black mech, heard them clearly. He turned his head and said, "We don't have the materials now, so we can only make do like this. Do you have any solidifying gears here?" "Yes. I'll go look for them immediately," said the officer loudly. The mechanics in the underground warehouse had long been dumbfounded by Su Li's miraculous mechanical repair skills. They actually did not notice the arrival of Jian Shuai outside the door at all. If it had been any other time, these soldiers would have probably fainted from excitement upon seeing the nation's girl suddenly appear by their side. However, at this moment, they had long been completely focused on the mechanical repair skills displayed by Su Lu, completely forgetting about everything else. Jian Shuai had a military uniform draped over her shoulders. Her arms were crossed in front of her chest as she leaned against the door, watching the scene in front of her with great interest. She had already remembered that Su Lu was originally an extremely talented mechanic. Her earlier shock gradually faded, but at this moment, seeing the fanatical worship in the eyes of those mechanics, for some reason, a faint sense of pride actually grew in her heart. Yesterday, Su Lu had escaped for thousands of miles and returned to the mountain for a surprise attack. Su Lu had left an incomparably deep impression on this nation's girl, but it was very strange. At this moment, Su Lu was wearing a tight-fitting military singlet, sweating profusely and holding the repair arm like he was holding a large gun. This scene really did give birth to some indescribable emotions in her heart. His figure is quite good. Jian Shuai looked at Su Lu, who was busy on the mech. Although not very muscular, the lines of his muscles were clearly defined, and subconsciously thought of this. Immediately, her cheeks reddened slightly, and she shrugged her shoulders in self-relief. The Black MX's damage was not too serious, but because Luoqiu Airport lacked most of the specialized parts, Su Lu could only use some common parts as replacements. This method of doing so would definitely cause the MX's combat power to decrease by a lot, but the fact that he could use those unimaginable ideas to make this Black MX stand up and run again was already very incredible. After a phase of the repair work was completed, the 6 mechanics officers left the warehouse. Su Lu wiped the sweat off his forehead, exhaled softly, and climbed down from the tall mech. He was very different from the average mechanic in the military. It was not because he understood this MX mech too well, but more because of the repair philosophy that Uncle Feng Yu had imparted to him back then. Whether it was a battleship or a mech, they were actually just tools used by humans, and were no different from household appliances. Adhering to this philosophy, Su Lu did not have any fear when repairing the mech. He dared to fill in any kind of random replacement equipment, whether it was self-cleaning equipment or household appliances. In any case, he only wanted this mech to be able to move. It had to be said that it was precisely because of this difference in philosophy, the perception of treating gold as dung, that Su Lu could do whatever he wanted without fear. As a result, the mechanic beside him was dumbfounded and worshipped him from head to toe. After climbing down from the mech, his body and face were full of black engine oil. Behind his hips hung heavy tools like a teenager, clanking and clanking, looking quite pathetic. Just at this moment, he turned around and saw a head of purple hair. Jian Shuai looked at him with a smile. In the spacious warehouse, it seemed that some crisp sounds of metal clashing could be heard, like wind chimes. You said that back then, father liked to carry a lot of tools behind him. Was it like what you are doing now? More or less. Su Lu said with a smile. He subconsciously scratched his head. The black high-density mech on his hands was all over his face, smearing it black. Jian Shuai covered her mouth and giggled. After a moment, she regained her composure and asked seriously, "Does the Ministry of Defense have a new mission for you?" "Not yet." Su Lu opened the workbench and began to arrange the tools. In a low voice, he said, "But I think they definitely won't ask me to send you back to the capital ring again. No matter what mission the Ministry of Defense gives me, I still have to fix my MX first. After leaving this mech, there's actually not much I can do." Jian Shuai was silent for a moment. She understood what Sulu meant. Whether it was the Special Mecha Battalion or the normal field forces, whether it was the Federation or the Empire, all pilots would have their own personal mecha. It was just like those warriors in ancient myths who rode their horses onto the battlefield. This is your mech. In a few days, you'll probably paint a lot of stars on it. She smiled and said, have you given it a name? This was a tradition of the federal military. Every time a mecha warrior killed an Empire mecha, they would have the right to paint a golden star on the left leg of their mecha. From last night until now, Jian Shui'er knew very well that Sulu had the right to paint at least 6 golden stars. Sulu thought seriously for a moment. Then, he raised his head and smiled. The white teeth on his dirty face were distinct. I'm going to call it Little Black Flower. He really doesn't know how to come up with names, Jian Shui'er thought silently. Chapter 430. The Nutshell Engineering Department's first prototype MX mecha was silver-white in color, so it was called Little White Flower. This MX was black, so it was called Little Black Flower. It sounded natural, but there was really nothing new about it. Jian Shui'er found that Su Li's ability to come up with names was on a completely different level from the mecha repair ability he had displayed earlier and the mecha control ability he had displayed last night. However, looking at this face full of black motor oil, looking at that mouth of ridiculously white teeth, looking at that pair of eyes that were not big but appeared exceptionally clear and sincere, without a single trace of impurity, Jian Shui'er narrowed her eyes. They were like the 2 crescent moons in the sky above the capital. She felt that at this moment, he really did look like a little black flower. Using a classifier like flower, using a noun like flower, to describe a man, especially such an ordinary-looking young man, made Jian Shui'er feel slightly embarrassed when she woke up. Her eyes shifted slightly, and she changed the topic. Pointing at the enormous black mecha behind Sulu, she asked, "This MX has been modified? Otherwise, how could it be so powerful?" She shrugged a little embarrassedly and continued, "I only know that cars can be modified." This sounded a little like the stage of finding topics to talk about before a date, but Sulu was slightly taken aback, and then replied earnestly and honestly, "There were some minor modifications, but as for how it differs from the fitted MX, if I didn't learn this, I really can't say for sure." This was the truth. In order to match Su Li's control characteristics, Shang Qiu and the Nutshell Engineering Department had decisively abandoned most of the long-range fire control system of the Little Black Flower. It was difficult to avoid any loopholes in the mecha's assembly system. Other than characters like Su Lu and Madman Li, even the best ace pilots of the federal military would find it very difficult to get used to operating this Little Black Flower. Some serious problems might even arise if they tried to operate it. Hearing this honest statement, Jian Shui'er's expression was somewhat unnatural. She shrugged cutely and pursed her pink lips self-deprecatingly. She grew up in the lees of Philadelphia and was doted on by thousands of people at the age of 12. Such a background and experience gave her a sense of pride in the Federation. However, this kind of pride had always been hidden deep in her bones, and she would never show it in front of ordinary people. However, although Sulu wasn't familiar with her, they had been together for such a long time. Furthermore, he was her biological father, so he couldn't be considered an ordinary person. From her point of view, Sulu was clearly using the enhanced maneuver platform. Why did he have to hide it from her? He even said that it was some kind of simulation system. Now that he could not explain it clearly, the proud national girl naturally did not want to continue asking. "Yes, I thought you were still resting. You must have worked hard last night." Sulu felt the change in Jian Shui'er's mood. He nervously wiped the oil on his hands onto his overalls and asked. Jian Shui'er came back to her senses. She didn't understand why she felt a little uneasy because of Su Li's concealment. She rubbed her hair a little angrily, raised her small face and spread out her hands and said, "There are some things I want to ask you." The two walked along the deep underground corridor and walked out of the warehouse. At this time, there were countless warships and military aircraft taking off at a high density in Luoqiu Airport. Most of the Federation soldiers were busy in a state of war, so no one paid attention to them. In the space, only the clear footsteps of the two people and the crisp sound of the wind chimes behind their butts could be heard. I always thought that I had been in Channel 23 for too long, so everyone felt close to me. The script of the TV series was well written, and the character of the female captain was very cute. Other than that, I am just a very ordinary person. Other than being a little good-looking, there is nothing to be proud of. Jian Shuier was draped in a light blue Federal Fleet officer's uniform, with a soft light gray thin jacket inside. Her hands were clasped in front of her body, and her picturesque eyebrows were slightly furrowed. The tenderness in front of the girl's chest was squeezed more clearly by her arms. Su Lu turned his head and looked at her. He was silent, but in his heart, he thought that for a girl to be as beautiful and moving as you, that was already her greatest strength. I don't even know how to wear clothes. You used to mock me. Jian Shuier stopped in her tracks. She crossed her arms and tilted her head to look at him seriously. I'm not even very competent as a celebrity. Su Lu thought of the concert stage last night. The girl's tight red dress that made the soldiers fall into a frenzy, and that dark uniform that couldn't be any shorter. He thought of the smoothness in the mecha and still remained silent, but in the depths of his heart, he whistled to express his amazement. In any case, I think we should all be very clear that I'm not some big shot. Su Lu suddenly turned his head. The dim lights in the underground corridor shone on her beautiful face, making him suddenly have some strange thoughts. His eyes gradually narrowed, and he asked slowly, "What are you trying to say?" "I don't understand." Jian Shuier's eyes flashed with a puzzled but determined light. "Why did the Department of Defense use me as bait? Why did the Empire's people really come after me? Can you understand?" "I can't." "You're here too?" Su Lu looked at her and asked. Jian Shuier lowered her gaze and said softly, "Don't forget, I'm also a soldier." Su Lu fell into silence. Jian Shuier's puzzlement was actually also his puzzlement. Last night, he had been continuously killing until the early morning. During this rare time of leisure, this puzzlement had already made him feel extremely strange. He knew that he was just an insignificant part of the vast battlefield, and he didn't have the ability to guess the grand scheme of the Federation's government and military. However, the fact that Jian Shuier was Uncle's daughter, in the end, made him feel uneasy. He didn't know how the military god made the judgment, why the Empire's people launched such a fierce attack as if they had taken an aphrodisiac. Could it be that His Majesty the Emperor of the Empire gave a random order, and then the expeditionary army in the north used this matter to vent their anger? It was hard to explain. Probably only Marshal Li knows about this matter. Su Lu looked at Jian Shuier and said with a serious expression. Jian Shuier looked straight into his eyes and said, "If I ask the old man, do you think he will tell me?" Su Lu shook his head. She was silent for a moment and then suddenly asked, could it be related to that father of mine?" Her father, her teacher, was a first-class wanted criminal of the Federation, the traitorous mechanic Yu Feng. In this war between the Federation and the Empire, it couldn't be ruled out that this background played a strange role. Just from the puzzlement in her heart, she was able to grasp certain things clearly like snow. It had to be said that the bloodline of the Lees of Philadelphia was indeed extraordinary. Hearing this judgment, Su Li's heart slightly tightened. After a moment of silence, he said, "I don't know, but I'll try my best to find out." The investigation of this matter was too difficult. According to his judgment, if it really was Jian Shuier's background that made the military god Li Pifu draw up such an inconceivable plan, then this secret might not be known by anyone other than the military god himself. "Thank you." Jian Shuier expressed her sincere gratitude. "You're welcome. This is what I should do." Su Li's answer was very formal, but if one carefully listened to every word, it revealed the complicated yet simple, distant yet close relationship between him and the national girl in front of him, from Donglin to the West Woods. Did you see the news just now? I saw it. Those 2 planets are under the absolute control of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. The Federation's electronic surveillance network didn't leave behind a single bit. The West Woods military is going to have a tough nut to crack this time. Those 2 planets are definitely more difficult than 5,460. Jian Shui'er explained to him. It seems like Commander Zhong is personally commanding at the front line. Su Lu suddenly thought of something and looked at Jian Shui'er. He frowned and said, "Madman Li, he must be there too." Jian Shui'er's beautiful brows slightly furrowed as she replied softly, "Originally, Su Lu thought that he was about to embark on a journey full of blood and smoke, so he didn't have time to rest. He was in a hurry to repair Little Black Flower's mecha, even ignoring the fact that Luochio Spaceport was severely lacking in standard MX mecha parts. However, after an entire day, the Federation's command center didn't give Su Lu any new tasks. They just let him rest in the spaceport. The second day, there were still no orders. They just let him rest. The third day was the same. On this planet, the flames of war were everywhere. Every second, there were people dying. There were bombs blasting through rock formations, sending up clouds of dust. Luochio Spaceport was also absolutely busy. Even the 6 mecha operators with red eyes didn't have time to record his repair process. They were all transferred to the front line. However, he and Jian Shui'er had nothing to do. They were just idling 24 hours a day waiting for death. This kind of feeling was a little strange. That night, after Su Lu conducted the 3rd assembly test on Little Black Flower, he dragged his tired body back to his room. During the day, he had already contacted Bai Yulan and found out that Group 7 had followed the mobile battalion back to the base camp that night. They would probably have to wait at least until the current phase of the war ended before they could reach Luochio Spaceport by land. Unable to sleep in the middle of the night, Su Lu laid on his bed with his hands behind his head. He watched the Federation's news on the television in a daze. The Federation Army's attack on Planet 5460 was going smoothly. The battle on the other 2 planets was as fierce as expected. With the West Woods Military District as the main force, plus the 13 divisions of the 1st and 2nd Military District, a total of 73 divisions were all deployed on the 2 planets. However, under the crazy firepower of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, the Federation had only managed to establish 7 bases on the surface. And they had paid a terrible price for it. The images broadcast through the news were all very heroic. It seems that the West Woods Tigers have really encountered a tough nut to crack this time. Although Su Lu had never met the fierce man from the Zhong family, because of his wife and little watermelon, and because the man had stood up for him, he had a very inexplicable sense of closeness to him. Naturally, he didn't want anything to happen to this commander. As for the crazy war machine Madman Li, he wasn't worried at all. Chapter 431. In the days of the war, there were brave Federation soldiers dying every second, and the 3 star systems at the edge of the West Woods had long been engulfed in blood and fire. The relevant government departments were definitely not stupid enough to allow the major TV stations to continuously publish the names of the fallen soldiers in black. On the contrary, the news was filled with victory reports and commendations that were constantly appearing on the news. And the name that appeared the most in these battle reports and commendations was the Federation's 3rd Military Region's 7th Mechanic Division. The war suddenly broke out, and the Federation's propaganda machine launched a simultaneous and intensive attack. In just a few days, the Iron 7 Division, which had been gradually forgotten by the public of the Federation, appeared in front of the entire universe with an unstoppable momentum. It had to be admitted that the performance of the Iron 7 Division in this victorious battle was definitely worthy of the glory that they were enjoying at this moment. On Planet 5460, the Imperial Expeditionary Force brazenly invaded the South, and the Federation's 3 lines of defense were on the verge of collapse. It was the Iron 7 Division's blockade at the front line of the Huangshanling Lonely Ridge that fired the first shot of the Federation's counterattack and set off a frenzied invasion of the North. This force completely annihilated the Imperial Moonwolf Group in the Mountain War Zone, and then immediately pursued the Imperial Assault Group, which had nearly 20,000 soldiers, for thousands of miles. However, what the Federal Military and Division Commander Du Shaoqing did not expect was that the 2 Federation divisions that retreated from the south of the demarcation line did not arrive at the designated location at the designated time. However, the Imperial Assault Group had already regained their senses and launched a fierce counterattack on the Glacier Plateau, trying to nail the Iron 7 Division's pursuit to the Red Plateau soil. Du Shaoqing, wearing sunglasses, silently raised his right hand and pointed to the north like an arrow. The arrow was already on the string, and it had to be released. The Iron 7th Division was exhausted, but they were still silent and valiant. They charged toward the Imperial Assault Group, who were trying to regroup and organize a counterattack. The valiant soldiers of the Federation and the soldiers of the Imperial Expeditionary Force, whose willpower was tempered by ice and snow, once again clashed with each other on the Red Plateau. The formation that had just been formed was once again disrupted. The Iron 7th Division still coldly continued their crazy and fierce pursuit. This desperate chase lasted from late night to early morning, and from early morning to dusk. It was unknown how much blood was sprayed into the sky, making the sunset incomparably bewitching red. That night, when the red clouds were as red as blood, the Iron 7 Masters obtained the final victory. However, they also paid an extremely disastrous price. The Imperial Expeditionary Force's strategy of defending and waiting for reinforcements, which had been maintained for decades, suddenly melted like ice and snow, just like the once every 3,000 years flow of this planet. The Maple Forest Alliance's many years of savings were all used up because of His Majesty's reckless order, and because of old General Ambry's ruthless and even somewhat desperate decision to leave his homeland. All of the Imperial Expeditionary Force's heavy weapons, secret land-based missile bases, electronically controlled micro-aircraft hangars, military deployments, and even the most real strength of the troops were all exposed in front of the Federal Army. With the Iron 7th Division's tragic victory as the starting point, the Federation began a rapid counterattack from the south to the north. Whether it was the command center, the West Woods Military District, or the Department of National Defense far away in the Capital Ring, none of them would let go of such a heaven-sent opportunity to plan for the results of this battle. The Federation had a total of nearly 3,400 M52 mechas, and more than 300 of them were thrown on the north-south border of this planet. Like countless cold iron protrusions, they mixed in with the automated mechanical troops and advanced towards the north. There were also dozens of strange black MX mechas appearing and disappearing in the mountains and wilderness. The Maple Forest Alliance retreated decisively like a tide, and the Federal Army chased after them fiercely like a forest fire, until the planet turned into a sea of fire. The Imperial Expeditionary Force's Maple Forest Alliance was made up of 9 Army brigades and 1 mecha brigade. Including the logistics and related officers in the base, they had a total of more than 218,000 people. When they retreated to the safe zone of mid-range missiles in the northern hemisphere that was covered in ice and snow, they had already left behind more than 60,000 corpses on the ground in the south. The Maple Forest Alliance took 17 mecha clans from the army brigades and took on the task of attacking on the front line. In the end, only 5 of them were able to retreat with their formation intact. What was more fatal was that under the attack of the Federation's air power and concentrated long-range missiles, it was very difficult for the Imperial armies to move their heavy firepower equipment into the warehouses hidden by the glaciers. The protracted battle was cut in half at the waist, and it was very difficult for them to continue. The plan of the Federation's Ministry of Defense was 1/3 complete, and the Imperial Expeditionary Force was holed up in the ice and snow of the northern hemisphere, without any signs of life. At this point, the general situation of Planet 5460 was set. The military commander of the Empire, old General Ambly, was not inferior to his counterparts in the Federation. In fact, he did not make a mistake. Although he did not think that this was a trap set by the Federation in the beginning, he was prepared to break the trap. However, he did not expect that the Federation would silently send another black noose into this big trap. As the saying goes, a big ring encircles a small ring. The old general of the empire lost because of the source, because of His Majesty the Emperor's random order. Old General Ambly's old face was as cold as the ice and snow around him. His sparse eyebrows were mixed with ice shards as he stood on the top floor of the base covered in ice and snow. His old hands continuously patted the steel railings, and his heart was filled with endless emotions and shock. How could the Federation have guessed His Majesty the Emperor's random order? Or could it be that the Federation's spies had unbelievably infiltrated the core of the Empire? Unlike the fireworks of the victory of Planet 5460, the remaining two-thirds of the Ministry of Defense's plan did not go so smoothly. The main fleet of the Federation had to be stationed at the Gary Corridor and the Night Scorpion Nebula. Even if they had to wait for 100,000 years, they had to be on guard against the appearance of the Imperial fleet. That was the scenario that the Federation feared the most. The Ministry of Defense's plan was to use Jian Shui'er as bait to ignite a local war, then use the local war to trigger a planetary war. Using this planetary war, they would then use this planetary war to lure the only fleet of the Imperial Expeditionary Force to leave the barren star field. Once the Imperial fleet was lured away, the Ministry of Defense would then secretly prepare for a large-scale landing on the other two fallen planets. They would be able to obtain the precious and safe outer space environment. There was nothing wrong with this plan, except that the Federation did not expect that old General Ambly would directly use the Federation's plan to start a tragic planetary war. Except that they did not expect that the Imperial Expeditionary Force would actually spend decades to set up such dense and violent stratospheric firepower on the two fallen planets. On these two planets at the border of the Sylvan region, although the Federation's offensive could not be said to be gloomy, it had sunk into a kind of chilling stalemate. Every moment, there were countless Sylvan native soldiers whose names were marked with black boxes, signifying their death. On the news, the Senate had just passed an order of commendation for the Iron 7th Division. At the same time, the commanders of the two divisions that delayed the military flight were immediately removed from their posts and sent back to the Capital Ring military court for trial. Su Lu narrowed his eyes, then turned off the TV and began to think about some problems with his eyes closed. The two divisions were directly under the command of the Westwoods Military Command. The Iron 7th Division was constantly on the news and receiving commendations. Su Lu did not find it strange. Although the troops led by Du Shaoqing were the first to go to the front lines, they had displayed a fierce iron will and outstanding military service, so it was natural for them to receive commendations. The problem was that the two fallen planets of the Westwoods Military Command that were the main offensive force were unable to break through the situation. Thinking of the rumors that Zhong Laohu of the Westwoods had been suppressing Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division, and the two Westwoods commanders who were arrested, Su Lu felt a little strange and thought about it. Although the son of the Zhong family in the Westwoods was really stupid, and those powerful relatives of the Zhong family were really annoying, Su Lu still sat on the side of the Westwoods Zhong family because that was the home of Little Watermelon and Mrs. Zhong. Su Lu fell into a deep sleep as he thought about this without a clue. Outside the spaceport, from time to time, the roar of battleships taking off and landing, the noisy sound of engines exploding, and the orderly and solemn footsteps of soldiers could not wake him up. Because this was a beautiful dream. However, when he turned around, he saw a young girl in a white dress standing by the window. The light from the sun shone in through the window, illuminating the young girl's youthful body and revealing her curves. What moved his heart the most was the pair of slender, tight, and smooth legs that did not match her height. They were somewhat exaggerated. The girl did not answer, but in the dream, Su Lu knew who she was because she had short purple hair. Su Lu felt that he was blaspheming an artist's oil painting. He reluctantly turned his head back, but he saw that the Shang Qiu under him had become the beautiful daughter of the Nan family. Nan Xiangmei, who was being pressed down by his strong body, was wearing a dark blue turtleneck imitation sweater. Her eyes were closed tightly, and her black eyelashes were slightly trembling. She seemed to be awake, but refused to open her eyes, as if she was expecting something. Her cheeks were full of shyness, and there was a touch of purity in her gentleness. However, in front of this purity, he was a little violent and excited. He grabbed the hem of the dark blue sweater and pulled it up, exposing Nan Xiangmei's white jade-like upper body to the air. Sulu only felt that it was warm and soft, and the fine particles on her creamy skin were shivering. It seemed that the air was a little cold. A little cold? It was indeed a little cold in the gatehouse, and the pear garden outside the window was still snowing. He looked up in excitement and confusion and saw the pair of black-rimmed glasses. However, the pair of eyes under the glasses did not have any sense of righteousness, only incomparably seductive and pure. The girl was also wearing a pair of red devil horns on her head, like a clumsy elf imitating a little goblin. Sulu, who was sweating all over, suddenly woke up. He sat on the bed in a daze for a long time, and looked at his hands in a daze. Then he walked into the bathroom dejectedly, turned on the tap, and began to wash his clothes. Chapter 432. Drying his wet underwear on the heater rack, he turned on the switch and let the cold water droplets fall from the sky. Sulu rubbed his skin hard until his back was red. He took a longer shower than usual. In the cold water, he raised his hands in front of his eyes in a daze. Looking at the white skin on his fingertips, he thought to himself that his hands should be used to operate a mecha. Although a mecha could indeed shoot down a plane, he didn't understand why he had this wet dream. Thinking about the romantic fantasy that flashed through his mind a few days ago, he couldn't help but be shocked at how much his moral standards had dropped while the level of testosterone in his body had increased too much. However, he completely didn't realize that in reality, the war and death on this planet itself was a supreme weapon that stimulated lust and shattered all spiritual rules. Holding the cold porcelain basin with both hands, he looked at the somewhat unfamiliar young face in the mirror. There was no steam in the bathroom, so there was no fog on the mirror. He didn't need to use his hands to wipe it away, but why did that face look so unfamiliar? The straight eyebrows were still resting peacefully above his eyes, like two unsheathed flying knives. The fine hair between his eyebrows hadn't been shaved for a long time. The two thick black lines seemed to connect together, but there was no sense of valiance. Matched with the pair of small eyes below, it made people feel that this face was very trustworthy. But it was still unfamiliar because that pair of eyes seemed too calm. Sulu looked at himself in the mirror and thought about a few years ago, after he scared off that person on Donglin's Clock Tower Street, he had also been silent and nervous in the bathroom mirror. That person was called Bao Longtao, right? How come he was almost forgetting his name? Sulu found that after he escaped from Donglin, he had become more and more silent and calm. However, this silence and calm, to him, was somewhat similar to an undesirable aura. He didn't think this was his nature, and he didn't like this kind of outward change, so he stared at himself in the mirror in a daze. He didn't understand what the Federation's plan was. Jian Shui'er said that the Westwoods military's main attack on the two fallen stars was very difficult, and that the days of the Zhong family's tiger were very difficult, but he didn't understand. He didn't understand the Empire's ferocious attacks and the resolute retreat, nor did he understand the Federation's meticulous and wondrous military arrangements, nor did he understand the art of war command. At the end of the day, he was just an insignificant character in the Grand Galactic War. He could only silently turn back to repair his mecha and then travel through the forest at high speed. This was his greatest reliance. However, he had already begun to kill his enemies. Those Imperial mecha that had exploded in front of him and behind him, those corpses that had died with their eyes wide open, their twisted bodies constantly stimulating his brain. When he was in Eastwood, he had no knowledge of the people of the Empire. It was only when he saw the black tombstones on the graveyard in Macklin that he had a direct understanding of the people of the Empire. Sulu had killed a lot of people. When he was a child, Blood dripped from the tip of the hydraulic pipe in the garbage dump, a gun barrel in the underground parking lot of Lynn High, and corpses were everywhere in the foundation building. He was a good person, and good people could kill without blinking, let alone someone from the Empire. However, it was too easy for people to die on the battlefield. Life was too cheap here. In the middle of the night, Sulu, who was hit hard by the atmosphere of war, felt a little lost in his youthful state. He walked out of his room and listened to the chaotic and nervous noises outside the spaceport. He silently lowered his head and walked towards the end of the quiet corridor. Little Black Flower's Mecca was quietly waiting on the other end. In the cold, dangerous, and complicated web of war, no matter how strong an individual's strength was, they were just an insect that was stuck in the web. They could be swallowed up at any moment. There was no chance of survival. He had to repair his personal MX. That way, he would have an extra set of armor and a few more sharp knives. When he struggled in the web in the future, he would be able to make a bigger commotion. There was a military satellite phone in the quiet corridor. Sulu silently thought for a moment. He turned his head, picked up the phone terminal scanner, and placed it behind his neck to scan it. After passing the authorization, he pressed a string of numbers. It was Shi Qinghai's phone call. The call was picked up very quickly. From this detail, Sulu knew that he had already arrived in the West Woods. His mood couldn't help but become heavier. "How's your job as a liaison officer?" Sulu leaned against the cold wall and smiled at his friend on the other end of the phone. "The overall situation here is not a problem, but there are still some dangers. But the Department of Defense hasn't sent any orders, so I'm just waiting for death in the spaceport." Shi Qinghai's bright and charming laughter came from the other end of the phone. Sulu smiled and began to talk about his feelings when he was on a battlefield for the first time. His tone was slightly heavy and worried. The war between the Federation and the Imperium was like a fight between two rock giants. Every heavy punch might not hurt the other party, but the falling pieces of rocks would definitely kill the other party. After a short pause, Sulu thought of the dream he had. His cheeks were slightly hot as he talked about it. Then he nervously asked in a hoarse voice, "Should I be in a relationship? But how can I like 4 people at the same time?" Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone suddenly asked, "Have you been stimulated by a woman recently?" Sulu shook his head. Strangely, Shi Qinghai on the other side of the planet seemed to have seen his movement. He said in a slightly mocking tone, "Although I'm busy now, I still watch the news. The scandal between you and that national girl is so big. Although you're wearing a pair of Toad sunglasses, do you think you can hide it from my lightning-like eyes?" Sulu was silent. Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone was silent for a while. Then he said seriously, "I think you should find a woman." Sulu replied, "Don't they mean the same thing? Falling in love doesn't mean that you can sleep with her, but you might have to get married. You definitely won't get married, but you definitely have to sleep with her." Shi Qinghai said sarcastically, "These are 2 very different things." "You mean, venting?" Sulu held the phone and lowered his voice. "Is this really that interesting? If it's not interesting, then why are you dreaming? I'm just asking. Why are you so angry?" Sulu was a little annoyed. He looked at the remaining time on the phone and suddenly said seriously, "You have to take care of yourself." The anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain were officially part of the government forces. They came to the front line of the West Woods to fight. Presumably, these soldiers would join the battlefield after some time. Sulu was very clear that there would be a lot of dangerous and complicated compromises and exploitation. Shi Qinghai's role as a liaison officer was very dangerous. Shi Qinghai on the other end of the phone was silent for a while. Then he said, "You also take care of yourself. Overly high-profile morality can only cultivate hypocrites. In my opinion, although our young leader has never put the word morality on his lips, he has always put it above his head, and he can't wait for everyone to see. Is this a big lie that looks real, or is it real gold and silver? The flames of war had spread to the glacier forest in the northern hemisphere. The long-range firepower of the Imperial Expeditionary Force was suppressed to the brink of collapse. This road that passed by the front line of the Huangshanling Lonely Ridge returned to silence. At this moment, a motorcade composed of dozens of military and civilian vehicles slowly drove over. The roaring sound of the engines broke the silence. In the back of a military vehicle, these extremely sarcastic words were even more harsh than the sound of the engines. Bai Yulan lowered her head and dozed off. She couldn't stop Lan Xiaolong from nagging. Her delicate eyebrows couldn't help but furrow. Lan Xiaolong was smoking a cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the blackened sparks on the mountain outside the window. He looked at the scattered metal wreckage and secretly assessed the extent of the battle that happened that night. His lips moved, but he didn't stop his sarcastic remarks. That old man is good. He took the nation's girl and ran away. He saved that camp. Isn't it cool? Isn't it glorious? But what about us? We didn't fire a single shot when we went to the front line. Although we didn't become deserters, we became leftovers and were thrown back to the headquarters by him. The cigarette on Lan Xiaolong's lips swayed up and down. He looked very interesting. The sarcastic expression on his face was full of sarcasm. The 7th Combat Team didn't fight a single battle. They're about to be transferred back to the West Woods. Speaking of which, all the battles were fought by our supervisor alone. Of course, we can only follow behind him and watch the show. What are we doing here? Traveling? In the carriage, Xiong Linquan had been carefully maintaining the heavy rotary machine gun. When he heard Lan Xiaolong's words, his face became a little ugly. The rest of the soldiers of the 7th Combat Team felt the same. Of course, they didn't have any opinions about Supervisor Su Lu. They just thought that since the war had started, they, who were originally very fierce, couldn't do anything because they had an even fiercer supervisor. It was really a little frustrating. You're not originally a member of the 7th Combat Team. Bai Yulan finally spoke softly. I don't understand why the division sent you here. Lan Xiaolong threw the cigarette out of the window. The cigarette landed on the charred platform of the grenade launcher, creating a small spark. He said, of course, it's to protect the Federation's treasure, our Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. Bai Yulan frowned. Damn it, how could they send a major to protect a lieutenant colonel? Furthermore, this guy's military skills were quite average. However, he had been in the port city's 83-84 unit for many years, so his military style was quite obvious. Lan Xiaolong ignored him and said to the men of the 7th Combat Team who had their heads lowered, our supervisor is on a mecha. Of course, we can't follow, but you have to think about it. He's already a lieutenant colonel. He can't be using a MX to pretend to be a soldier and kill everywhere. In the West Woods, in the Empire, in the mountains, in the grasslands, constantly killing in and out, playing the hero 7 times in and out, and finally dying of exhaustion and walking to the end of the road? Bullshit. He has to be the commanding officer of the unit, like a regiment commander or division commander. However, we all know that although that guy has been studying commanding teaching materials every day for the past few months, when it comes to commanding, he doesn't have much of a future. He's a few thousand streets behind someone like Du Shaoqing. When the time comes, what do you think we can do for him? Gu Shifeng, Lu Jiao, Xiong Linquan, you all need to think about it carefully. Lan Xiaolong was like a hooligan as he gestured around. Bai Yulan, who had her head lowered and remained silent, suddenly felt a chill in her heart. She thought about how the Department of Defense had directly transferred this guy from the 17th Armored Division to her team. She thought about how her 7th Combat Team couldn't get rid of the background of the 17th Armored Division. Bai Yulan gradually understood what was going on. Her eyes, which were separated by thin strands of hair, suddenly shone brightly. Chapter 433. The light in Bai Yulan's eyes gradually dimmed. She lowered her head and listened attentively to Lan Xiaolong's incessant nagging. At this time, she already had a certain judgment in her mind. Listening to Lan Xiaolong's seemingly roguish and decadent literary tone, she was getting more and more suspicious. The famous people in this universe, the big shots, often started to build their own team when they were lonely, unknown, or at the bottom level. Now, the subordinates of Du Shaoqing, who was famous in the Federation, when he first joined the Iron 7th Division, had grown into his most loyal partners and executors. The subordinates trained by the god of war Li Pifu in several wars had now become the heroes of the military. Even President Pabre, who was deeply respected by everyone, was now an officer in the secretary's office. In this year, the Federation government, the Lees of Philadelphia, and Minister Zhou of the Department of National Defense re-established the 7th Combat Team and sent this amazing team to the training base. Without a doubt, they were trying to let Su Lu have a team that belonged exclusively to him. However, what made Bai Yulan feel slightly sad was that Su Lu didn't seem to have much interest in building a team and expanding his influence in the future. Although the core members of the 7th Combat Team had already recognized the young lieutenant colonel's ability and temperament after the graduation day military drill and these few months of interaction, he didn't have the self-awareness to become a leader himself. On the contrary, it was this strange Major Lan Xiaolong who had been supporting Su Lu for the past few months. He inspired the self-awareness of the members of the 7th Combat Team on behalf of the young lieutenant colonel who was like a rock. He subtly influenced this team to be under Su Li's influence. A faint smile appeared on Bai Yulan's face. She took out a cigarette from her jacket pocket and stuffed it into her slightly dry lips. She took a deep breath with great enjoyment. Boss might be the commander of the 17th Division in the future, but what would he be in the future even further? A new marshal. As long as the members of the 7th Combat Team could return to their hometown alive from the battlefield, they would definitely have a very good life. The fleet drove into Luoqiu Airport. The performance team and the broadcasting team of the Federation TV station, who had experienced the baptism of the battlefield, saw the large warships taking off and landing. Before they had time to relax, they were controlled by the strong impulse to leave the battlefield of life and death and return to the rear. Some female staff members were so excited that they even shed tears. For Sister Tong, not being with Miss for nearly 100 hours was something that had never happened in the past 7 years. Her mood had long been nervous to the extreme. Towards Su Li's action of taking the young miss away without her consent, she was extremely angry. However, when she saw the young man and man walking together in the barracks, the anger in her heart instantly became a faint sense of loss. Jian Shui, was wearing a light-colored short windbreaker as she nestled beside Su Lu like a docile little bird. Her expression was calm and peaceful. Looking at this scene, Sister Tong uncomfortably confirmed that the escape that night had already caused the young miss to have absolute trust in this small-eyed officer. What would happen when a man and a woman were alone in a small cabin? Sister Tong didn't want to think about it, and she immediately remembered that they were originally a blind date, the core of the Federation scandal. Without any rest, everyone boarded the warship specially dispatched by the Ministry of National Defense and left this planet full of blood and fire. Su Lu, wearing sunglasses, stood by the wide porthole and narrowed his eyes to look at the colorful planet floating in the black universe. Thinking of the smoke of war and the soldiers who died on the battlefield that night, he slightly pursed his lips and believed that he would be back soon. Bai Magnolia walked behind him and handed him a cup of freshly brewed green tea. She said softly, "I just received the order from the company to escort Miss Jian Shui, to the main planet of the West Woods. Then, the 7th Combat Team will rest here and wait for the next mission." Whatever he thought of, it came. Su Lu took the teacup, thanked her, and smiled bitterly. He was about to say goodbye to Jian Shui, and the real battlefield in the stars was waiting for him and the men of the 7th Combat Team. The indicator light above the porthole rang, and the deck of the hull was ready to close. The light warship began to accelerate in preparation for entering the twisting passage of the Huiming corridor. The flowing light outside the window was pulled into a strange light circle like leaves. Su Le retracted his gaze and looked down at the green leaves floating in the green tea in the glass. He was silent. Sunset State, the main planet of the West Woods, Changfeng Military Base. Countless spacious landing platforms were densely packed in the wilderness like lakes. The warship that the Victory Concert team took when they first arrived in the West Woods was docked in the Changfeng Military Base. However, the base today was much more tense and busy than before. The war had begun, and countless weapons, ammunition, and resources sent from the capital ring had to be transported to the front line through this largest military base. Su Le still wore his sunglasses and stood behind Jian Shui, vigilantly looking around. His gaze swept past her shoulder and looked at the fleet that was driving out from under the warship, especially the black car that belonged to him. Today, they would be staying at the Venus Hotel for the night. Then, Jian Shui, and her team would return to the capital ring, and the two sides would officially separate. Su Le did not have too many feelings of sadness in his heart. Because of the uncle, there were too many stories that needed to be told between them, and too many unknown possibilities. Her bright purple hair was as smooth as silk. Jian Shui, looked ahead calmly. She didn't turn her head, but she knew that the man behind her was looking at her from the corner of his eyes. She thought about how he was her father's only student and the blind date arranged by her family. She thought about how he had watched her grow up and how he knew her age, birthday, and even her private data. She wanted to laugh, but her beautiful cheeks blushed, just as she was about to turn around and have a serious conversation with this very interesting guy. A bouquet of very bright roses came to her and interrupted some of the inexplicable emotions that had just arisen. The Zhong family of the West Woods indeed had an unimaginable power and status in this region. Zhong Ziki, the nephew of Commander Zhong who was deeply doted on, could easily enter the security area of the military base at such a tense time of war. I have a pass. Zhong Ziki, who was holding the bouquet of flowers, did not say anything to Jian Shui, who had a slightly stunned expression. Instead, he said to Su Le who was behind her, "You have a bright future ahead of you. I don't want to offend the person favored by the old man, but I'm just here to give you a bouquet of flowers, so I'm sure you won't mind." As soon as the Zhong family's fleet appeared in sight, the armed members of Group 7 had already prepared security measures. However, Su Le did not say anything, so everyone remained calm. Zhong Ziki looked at Su Le and said, "Last time at the hotel, Mad Manly already helped you regain your dignity. This time, I've decided not to give you any chance to slap my face." These words were said very sincerely. Ever since he found out about Su Le's background, Zhong Ziki had already given up on the thought of seeking revenge on him within a short period of time. However, when he saw the rumors about Su Le and Jian Shui, spreading like wildfire on the news, he felt as if his heart had been stabbed 300 times with a knife and 2 jars of sea salt had been needed. It was so unbearable that he couldn't say it out loud. Therefore, he came with sincerity and grace today. "I want to compete with you fairly." Zhong Ziki smiled. His face could be considered handsome, but because of his slightly wrinkled nose, he looked a little repulsive. He only knew that Su Le was a person he could not afford to offend, but he did not know Jian Shui's background. He said gently and politely, "Miss Jian Shui, please accept my flowers, and please don't misunderstand that I am harassing you. You must know that Master Schiller once said, 'I love you, what does it have to do with you?'" Jian Shui, playfully raised her eyebrows, looked at Zhong Ziki in front of her, and asked, "Are you sure you love me?" Zhong Ziki's brows furrowed. After thinking for a long time, he said, "I can't say that now. In the past, I only felt that you were a treasure, and it would definitely feel good to have you in my arms. But now, I like you with respect." From these words, it could be seen that the secret of the Federation's Department of Defense's successful military operation had not been hidden from this young master of the Zhong family. Now that he admitted that he did not love her, the anger in Jian Shui's heart subsided a little. The girl smiled sweetly and said, "Since it has nothing to do with me, then what does it have to do with me?" At this time, the black car silently slid to the side of the group. Lan Xiaolong pushed open the driver's door and walked behind Su Lu. With a trace of mischief, he said softly, "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu, I've always thought that you should learn how to be jealous and act like a spoiled brat." Seeing that he did not respond, Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said to Bai Yulan and the others behind him, "If he doesn't know how to do it, then you should help him." Bai Yulan lowered her head, thinking to herself, "We're soldiers, not henchmen who are going to kidnap innocent women for the young master." At this time, Jian Shui, very seriously said to Zhong Ziki, "I allow you to secretly like me from afar, as long as you don't let me know." These words were said very calmly and indifferently, but there was a very subtle and very sharp mockery in them. Zhong Ziki's face gradually turned pale. Although he did not act out because of Su Lu behind the national girl, the anger in his heart would probably continue to burn for a very, very long time. Su Lu had been silent because he was thinking. Looking at the countless battleships and transport ships that frequently took off and landed in the Changfeng base through the lens of his sunglasses, he naturally thought of the smoke and blood on planet 5460 and the tragic landing battle on the two fallen planets. At such a time of war, people like Zhong Ziki actually had the leisure to play the drama of jealousy and chasing after celebrities. At this time, under the battleship, a few minutes of tit-for-tat fighting, there were probably many Federation soldiers on the front line who had fallen on the battlefield and could never stand up again. This strong contrast made his mood a little heavy and annoyed. Was he going to play the kind of drama "you don't know who my backer is, so I bully you. I just watch with a smile, then I use my backer to bully you back. Then a bystander will pull out an even more powerful backer to bully everyone and have fun." This was a good way to pass the time and lengthen the length of the boring story in his boring life. However, he was not willing to live such a life. Chapter 434. He had never been valiant. He had only silently swept past the battlefield, seeing a few clumps of smoke and a few spots of mangled flesh. It was not enough to shake or change Su Lu, this Donglin rock, too much. It was just that his rock-like heart had long returned to Donglin after he had truly gotten used to life and death. When he was hanging out with a group of orphans on Clock Tower Street, who had any family background. It was just a competition of whose knife was faster and whose brain was more nimble. At this time, he looked at Zhong Erlang through the flowers. A man's heart was not as strong as iron, but his eyes were like iron, cold and tough. It was as if the wide sunglasses on the bridge of his nose were going to crack. Zhong Ziki was angry at the national girl's mockery when he suddenly felt this pair of eyes and felt a chill all over his body. A moment later, he slowly raised his head without showing any weakness and coldly looked straight into Su Li's eyes. In the eyes of many people, and even in his own eyes, there was no doubt that he was the only heir of the Westwoods Zhong family because of the favor of the tiger of the Zhong family. This identity gave him too much right to be proud and arrogant. That day at the Venus Hotel, even a real lunatic like Li Feng did not dare to shoot him, let alone this young lieutenant colonel in front of him. After that day, Zhong Ziki carefully investigated Su Li's background and confirmed the secret relationship between him and the Lis of Philadelphia. However, he was not afraid. Moreover, he had the Zhong family's direct security forces by his side today. 7 stern-looking bodyguards in black silently stood behind Zhong Ziki. They were all retired special forces from the Westwoods military region and were exceptionally strong. With such a group of powerful bodyguards by his side, Zhong Ziki was not worried about his own safety. Instead, he was a little ashamed that he had been shocked by Su Li's cold gaze. He stared at Su Lu with a slightly heavy expression and said coldly, "Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu." Su Lu did not listen to him at all. The light in his narrowed eyes gradually faded. He stepped forward and held Jian Shui's hand, turned around, and walked toward the black car. Zhong Ziqi's expression changed drastically. The humiliation of being disregarded had reached a level that he and his family could not bear. After opening the back door of the black car and letting Jian Shui'er in, Su Lu turned around and looked at the young master of the Zhong family behind the bouquet of flowers. He slowly took off his sunglasses and said in a serious tone, "If you dare to harass her again, I will beat you until your uncle can't recognize you." Su Lu was a person who pretended to be cool. He did not purposely force these words out of his mouth. His tone carried the air of the Sunset State. He was simply stating a principle, and because of its simplicity, it was exceptionally believable. People have names, just as trees have shadows. If it was an ordinary lieutenant colonel of the Federation who said such a sentence, Zhong Ziqi would only find it extremely absurd. He would wantonly hold his stomach and laugh out loud. Then, with a serious expression, he would beat up this lieutenant colonel until his life or death was unknown. However, the person who said this sentence was Su Lu. Therefore, this extremely vulgar and uninteresting vulgar threat was spat out from his thin lips. In an instant, it turned into an extremely cold wind of 5,460 degrees Celsius. It whistled past the spacious landing pad, making everyone feel an endless chill. Su Lu had the combat strength to contend with Madman Li. He also had a notorious reputation for not following the rules like Lin Banshan. The reason why the leaders of the 1,000-year-old families in the capital ring did not want him to come out of the black dungeon and why they were so wary of this lone figure was none other than the fact that he dared to kill. He could kill. Clearly, this world had not forced him to the extreme, but he dared to kill without reason. After hearing this threat, Zhong Ziqi, whose expression had changed drastically due to anger, suddenly turned pale. This was because he knew that Su Lu would definitely do what he said. Even those powerful bodyguards from the Westwoods Military Special Battalion who were silent behind him could not help but change their expressions when they thought of the deeds that Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu had done. They carefully and cautiously approached Zhong Ziqi. A strange blush appeared on Zhong Ziqi's pale face. He stared at Su Lu beside the black car and said, "Good, good, good, but I have to remind you of one thing. This is the West Woods. This is not a world where you can make a living with your fists. I have already given you enough face," he said in a deep voice. "Since you are not willing to give me back my face, then I will also put my words here. As long as she is still in the West Woods, I will pursue her. If you think this is harassment, you can come and beat me." When he said this, Zhong Ziqi did not back down. He took 2 steps toward the black car and said mockingly, "In fact, I am going to continue to harass you. I want to know how you will beat me." The black-clothed bodyguards behind him also walked up, vigilantly watching the combatants of Group 7 around them. A few of them had already reached their hands into their black suits. Their movements were very natural and relaxed, as if they were reaching for a cigarette. Everyone present knew that these people were definitely not touching cigarettes, but sharp killing weapons. However, they did not deliberately hide it. They just did it expressionlessly. A strong enough deterrent force gushed out from the simple action of reaching into their clothes. The Federation strictly controlled firearms. Except for local tyrants or warlords like the Zhong family in the West Woods, who would dare to openly use guns in the military base. Everyone in Group 7 had a solemn expression. They stared at these experienced professional soldiers and silently waited for the follow-up development. Zhong Ziqi's confidence was based on this. Although he was angry, it was impossible for him to openly mobilize 2 battalions to kill Su Lu on the spot. However, the fierce character that grew up in the military compound made him have the impulse to pull out a gun in front of Su Lu. He looked at Su Lu coldly. His expression seemed to say, "Come and beat me, come and beat me." It was not Su Li's fist that came, but a delicate military knife. A delicate hand gently held the streamlined knife handle made of black fragrant wood as if it was holding a flower. Suddenly, it cut the air of Changfeng Base, which was full of the sound of wind, and brought a more shrill wind sound. With a sound, the blade flashed and cut the flower petals in front of Zhong Ziqi. Then the blade twisted and gently rested on his throat like lightning. What a fast blade! The faces of the bodyguards of the Zhong family in the West Woods changed dramatically. They pulled out their pistols with a jaw-dropping speed and aimed at the person holding the knife. However, they did not pull the trigger, because the delicate knife had been quietly placed on the artery of Zhong Ziqi's neck, and it did not tremble at all. The blade was very stable, and not trembling at all was actually scarier than not trembling at all. The chopped red flower petals rustled and fell down. The sound of guns being loaded rang out all around them. The clear sound was mixed with endless solemnity. The men of Group 7 had already raised the Cayenne light machine guns in their hands and coldly surrounded the bodyguards of the Zhong family. The barrels of the guns were pitch black, revealing a chilling killing intent. What was more terrifying was the buzzing sound. Xiong Linquan stood outside the crowd, and his two muscular arms were holding a heavy Carlin rotary cannon, aiming at all the people of the Zhong family. Bai Yulan's right hand gripped the delicate knife, while her left hand gently brushed away the strands of black hair in front of her eyes. She looked at the Zhong family's bodyguards who were aiming their guns at her and said softly, "At least for now, we have more guns. I advise you to put down your guns." Group 7 was equipped with heavy firepower used on the battlefield. With a casual round of bullets, these well-trained professional soldiers of the Zhong family could only end up in a pool of blood. Zhong Ziqi's face was pale, and he raised his head without saying a word. Since the death of his father, his head had always been held high, never falling. But at that time, it represented his dignity and the glory of his family. But now, it represented humiliation and fear. The fear came from the cold and delicate knife on his neck, from the sound of guns being loaded, and from the high-speed rotation of Dalin's soul. He couldn't understand, these mercenaries clearly knew who he was, why did they still dare to raise their guns? He couldn't understand, why did this quiet man in front of him, who looked like a girl, dare to point a sharp knife at his vitals? Kill me if you have the guts. We are carrying out a military mission. If you continue to harass Miss Jian Shuier, I will kill you with my own hands. Bai Yulan deepened Su Li's previous threat. He quietly looked at Zhong Ziqi's pale face, and after saying this, he didn't speak again. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that Su Lu had already closed the door. This delicate man's lips curled up into two beautiful arcs, and his fingers slightly tightened. A streak of blood appeared on Zhong Ziqi's fair neck. The blood vessels that had appeared on the surface of his skin due to his anger and fear were immediately forced back under the skin by the cold and pain. His legs were somewhat weak, and his lips were sore and numb. He was simply unable to say anything. Bai Yulan slowly put away the knife and put it back into his pocket. He didn't even look at the Zhong family soldier who was pointing a gun at his forehead. He gently reached out his hand and pulled the gun away, and then walked back to his military vehicle. What a good show! Lan Xiaolong smiled as he looked at this scene. He thought that the guys from Group 7 finally understood what kind of formation they had to put on in order to stand up for their boss. And those big shots from the Department of National Defense would definitely like this slightly cliché show. Retreat. He calmed himself down and smiled as he saluted Zhong Ziqi. He waved his hand and signaled the members of Group 7 who were holding numerous large guns ready to fire at any time to leave. The smoke and dust dispersed in the wind. Zhong Ziqi covered his neck and stared blankly at the convoy that was leaving. His face was pale as he thought of those men holding guns, and the knife that was on his neck. He could clearly feel that if there was a conflict earlier, that knife would have really cut open his carotid artery, and those Cayenne machine guns and Dailings would have really dared to open fire. Countless small cold beads appeared on young Master Zhong's back, and he couldn't help but shiver. The original anger and vengeance in his heart was shattered by that cold feeling. Chapter 435. In the luxurious suite on the top floor of the Golden Star Hotel, a few minutes after the sparse splashing sound disappeared, Jian Shuier tied her wet hair behind her neck. Wearing a pink and white bathrobe, she lowered her head and wiped the water droplets as she walked out. Under the bathrobe, her bare feet gently stepped on the expensive carpet, leaving a few wet footprints. Sulu stood up from the sofa. His eyes swept over the girl's jade-like little feet. He picked up the automatic dry bag and handed it to her. Then he turned around and stubbed out the cigarette butt. Jian Shui'er naturally took it and put it on her head. It looked like she was wearing a small hat. With her clear face and beautiful facial features, she looked very beautiful and cute. There was no one else in the suite. The two of them were alone. They silently handed over the things and looked very natural and intimate. There was a faint feeling of being part of the C family. And in the eyes of many people, they were already a couple. Even Sister Tong was not in the room. Jian Shui'er sat on the sofa, curled up her legs, tilted her head, and gently dipped a cotton bud into the water in her ear. She said softly, "I know you have a close relationship with the Zhong family, but it's not good to offend the future heir of the Zhong family." When the soft pink cotton swab entered and exited, it would occasionally touch the girl's soft and tender earlobes, causing them to tremble slightly. Sulu narrowed his eyes as he watched, and many inexplicable emotions welled up in his heart. The national girl in his dreams back then was actually able to show her most private side in front of him like a family member. This world's affairs were truly somewhat lamentable. Listening to Jian Shui'er's slightly worried words, he smiled and did not explain anything. In fact, he was worried that after tomorrow's separation, the young master of the Zhong family in the West Woods would harass Jian Shui'er relentlessly. That was why he was so tough in the Changfeng military base today. Especially when Jian Shui'er was not willing to let the world know her real family background. To deal with a possessive playboy with a strong family background, Sulu could only use the absolute threat of death to suppress his ambitions and desires. Seeing that Sulu did not care about her words, Jian Shui'er sighed softly. A trace of sadness appeared on her beautiful little face. She looked at him and said, "The Ministry of National Defense will escort us back to the capital ring. You don't have to worry about anything." Sulu nodded. Jian Shui'er took off the small hat-like dry hair bag and rubbed her fluffy purple short hair. She was like a cute little lion that shook its head vigorously in the sun after crossing a clear stream. There was a kind of beauty that was full of vitality. Without warning, suddenly, she leaned against the sofa, held her chin, looked at Sulu seriously, and said, "I have something that I need your opinion on." Sulu was stunned and looked back at her on the sofa. He knew that when this national girl was 12 years old, she was determined to leave the Lees of Philadelphia. Even if she fought a long-lasting lawsuit, she still forced the military god Li Pifu to make a concession. Such a determined girl had her own plans for everything she did. What did she need his opinion on? "I plan to grow my hair long and then dye it back to black." Jian Shui'er blinked and said, "What do you think?" Su Li's heart relaxed. It turned out to be such a small matter. However, immediately after, he had a strong feeling in his heart. This bright purple hair was the collective memory of many Federation citizens. It was the trace of his past years. She actually wanted to dye it black. It depends on what you like. He awkwardly scratched the black hair on top of his head and said, "If you want to ask for my opinion, of course I like the color of your hair now." After saying this, Sulu was suddenly stunned. He immediately thought of something else and looked at the girl on the sofa with astonished eyes. Jian Shui'er smiled slightly and looked at him quietly. In fact, she also did not understand why she wanted to ask for Su Li's opinion before she made this decision. Was it just because he was her father's only student, so she felt close to him? Or was it because she had gotten used to trusting him after this period of time together? And at this moment, Su Li's reaction made her confirm that under his sincere face, there was indeed an intelligent heart. "This is my last concert. My contract with Department 23 is about to expire. I will not continue to act in that TV series." The national girl, Jian Shuier, was about to end her acting career. In this period of time that was full of news about war, it was presumably the most shocking news. And Su Lu, other than herself, was the first person in this universe to know of this news. Su Lu looked at her in surprise and was speechless for a long time. When I was young, I left Philadelphia for the capital because I wanted to live a different life. As a star, I could play different roles and live many lives. But later on, I found that I could not live any kind of life. Jian Shuier cutely stuck out her tongue and said, I can't play a bad woman, I can't act in kissing scenes, I can't act in nude scenes. Even if I wanted to, the TV station and scriptwriter would not dare to write it. Su Li's eyebrows twitched painfully. He thought that not to mention the influence of the old man in Philadelphia, if the scriptwriter really dared to write it and the TV station dared to broadcast it, he and the countless audiences in the Federation would be too scared to watch it. Even if they watched, they would cover their hands and open their fingers. They would be extremely shy. He bitterly smiled and said, Last time, I said that you have graduated from the Battleship Command Department, but you know that the old man will never allow you to go to the front line. If you go on a battleship, all the operators will only look at you and it will be easy for an accident to happen. Let's not talk about this. Jian Shuier slightly lowered her eyes. Her long eyelashes covered her delicate white skin and a long bath towel covered her delicate white legs. You have to be more careful in the front line. As for the things we talked about last time, if it is not easy to investigate, you don't have to. Su Lu was silent. In Luoqiu Airport, he and Jian Shuier needed an answer to the doubts in their hearts. However, at present, it seemed that the answer was only in the mind of the military god Li Pifu or the emperor of the empire. It was indeed very complicated to find the answer. When we were there last time, I didn't ask about my father. Jian Shuier slowly raised her head and looked through the floor-to-ceiling window in the direction of the silver beach, where the sound of waves came from in the night. There was a trace of sadness and longing in her big eyes. There was a touch of coldness and disdain on her sharp chin that was probably unique to the Li family. However, after a while, this sadness and longing merged together and turned into some kind of determination. She looked back at Su Lu with squinted eyes. She was not cute but persistent. She said seriously, I really want to know the real story of my father. I really want to know why he became a traitor. Do you want to know? I want to know more than anyone else. Su Li's eyes also narrowed. Don't worry, if one day I know these things, I will immediately inform you, as long as I am still alive. The next day, the entire Victory Concert team came to the Changfeng military base again. Although the fierce battle at the front line was now in full swing and the army's mission was very heavy, the federal military was very clear about the importance of this national girl and this concert in this victory military operation, so they specially held a small farewell ceremony. Because of the news incident last time, Su Lu did not stand next to Jian Shuier. Instead, he quietly hid in the crowd. He looked at the beautiful figure of Jian Shuier bathed in the flash in front of him and the submissive by Magnolia behind her. His heart moved slightly. He hoped that the young master of the Zhong family would behave for a few days under his threat and by Magnolia's sharp knife. Military reporters had sharper eyes and deeper information channels than ordinary journalists. The war that broke out in 5460 seemed to have some hidden relationship with Jian Shuier. They absolutely did not believe that the federal military's victory military operation and this victory concert only had the same name. Countless loud questions sounded on the base landing platform. Flashes lit up from time to time. However, under the control of the Westwoods Military Publicity Department officers, no one dared to ask too many questions. Therefore, Jian Shuier could use her signature invincible girl smile to silently block these questions. A natural star, if not a star, what else can you do? In the crowd, Su Lu silently looked at the lively scene. On one hand, he thought about the girl's trustworthy announcement last night. On the other hand, he was secretly glad that no reporters discovered his existence. The light battleship on the landing platform had already completed the preparation for takeoff. The unique low buzzing sound of the crystal engine gradually covered the questions and noise in the field. At this moment, Jian Shui'er, who was surrounded by the crowd, suddenly flashed an inexplicable smile on her face. She was beautiful and lively with playfulness, which attracted the attention of many reporters. In the shocked eyes of the crowd, the national girl turned around and walked into the crowd. The crowd naturally separated to form a passage. Wearing a light-colored windbreaker, she walked to the front of Su Lu and gently hugged his stiff body. She gently pressed her face against his chest and said with a smile in a voice that only the two of them could hear, "Don't forget that we are on a blind date. I have to explain to the Feicheng family." The reporters and the crowd looked at this scene in disbelief. In an instant, someone reacted and shouted, "It's Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu." So he was hiding here. Su Lu lowered his head and quickly took out a pair of sunglasses and put them on his face. However, in the next moment, countless flashes lit up around him. It was like countless suns trying to evaporate every drop of water in his body that was as stiff as a rock at this time. Jian Shui'er smiled and hugged him. She leaned on him and said softly, "Bear with it. The next time we meet again, maybe I will already be a reporter." Su Lu was stunned. He looked down at the beautiful face of the girl in his arms and couldn't speak. "Help me take care of Li Feng on the front line." Jian Shui'er stood up straight and gently held his hand. She looked at him and said seriously, "My nephew is very pitiful." At this time, Su Lu could no longer hear the questions of the reporters around him. There was no flash in his eyes, only the beautiful face in front of him. His face was extremely stiff, and was even about to twitch. Chapter 436. Just like in the legends, he went to the front lines at the age of 12, piloting a mecha and starting a blood-soaked game. He slaughtered more than 100 ace mecha pilots at the edge of the Bermuda Triangle and the outskirts of the space passage, earning himself the reputation of being invincible in the military. His personality was violent and arrogant to the extreme. With his solid battle results, he was promoted to become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the history of the Federation. Su Lu really could not understand what madman Li had to take care of. What was so pitiful about him? This question perplexed him all the way until he took a bath. Dense droplets of water sprayed down from his head and face, but it was unable to wash away his doubts. This was because he knew that Jian Shui'er was not as lovable and cute as she appeared on the surface. Every word that the young girl said naturally had its own reason. He turned on the tap, picked up the towel, and rubbed his face forcefully twice. He rubbed his face until it was slightly red. He raised his head to look at the bathroom and confirmed that there should not be any surveillance equipment here. So, he slowly closed his eyes, lowered his body slightly, and squatted into a standard horse stance. In the midst of the fog, he began the practice that he had long been accustomed to. The tremors at the edge of the Eastwood mine had already pierced into his skin. No one could see the strange traces under his tight skin. Only he could feel the clear burning lines slowly moving along those lines that he did not understand. They squeezed out energy from the friction between every pair of muscle fibers and even every cell wall, gradually spreading to every part of his body. In the hot fog, Su Lu closed his eyes tightly and took a deep breath. He used his biological clock to confirm that the time for the horse stance was up. His right foot left the ground and placed behind his left knee like a sheathed sword. At the same time, his two hands left his body and spread to the sides, forming a W-like shape. The center of gravity of his entire body was placed on his left foot. However, his movements were so natural and casual. The muscle lines under his skin were faintly discernible, hard and elastic. After maintaining this posture for 5 minutes, he changed his posture. He put his head down, his right hand on the wet ground, his left knee slightly bent, his left hand bent behind his back to support his waist. At the same time, he lifted his right foot back, and his entire body became a straight line. This posture looked very normal, but to maintain it for a long time was exceptionally difficult. After another 5 minutes, Sulu began to change his posture again. Sulu completed the 10 postures that he had learned when he was a teenager one by one, without a second of delay. Every movement was done to the extreme according to the uncle's requirements. The muscles and meridians in his body were twisted to the limit that the human body could bear. Back then, it was a huge problem for him to complete these 10 strange postures beside the mine. However, after so many years, these postures had become a part of his body's instinct, and they were exceptionally smooth and natural to him. After completing the 10 postures, he lightly exhaled a mouthful of foul air, and besides feeling slightly sore and numb from head to toe, he felt a wisp of refreshing and natural feeling. Sulu looked at his blurry face in the mirror and scratched his head. Suddenly, a trace of worry appeared on his thick black eyebrows. He did not know if there were geniuses in this universe, but at least he knew very well that so-called geniuses were just hard work that exceeded what normal people could bear. Since he was very young, as long as time allowed, he had never stopped practicing these 10 postures. Being able to have the personal strength that shocked the 7 great families, being able to use the simulation system to control a military mecha and kill everywhere, was actually all due to his silent and determined daily training. However, this time, the battle on planet 5460, the weakness and hunger in his body at the end of the battle reminded Sulu of the many times he had risked his life to kill. He found that his ability had a very difficult flaw to solve, that was, every time he relied on the strange power in his body to split mountains and cut seas, his strength would drain very quickly. As a result, he would only shine for a moment before finally falling into a predicament where he could not continue. This was not difficult to explain. As a mechanical engineer who believed in scientific principles, although Sulu could not explain those mysterious abilities that the uncle had taught him, he could easily explain this phenomenon: energy was always balanced. In an extremely short period of time, he had exploded with an extremely large amount of strength, or rather energy, then his body would definitely quickly fall into a weakened state. In normal life, jealousy, fighting, causing trouble, and killing people was not a big problem. At most, he would just roll up his sleeves or take off his clothes to have a good time, and then ignore it afterwards. However, now that he was on the front lines of the West Woods, facing those cruel and terrifying Imperial soldiers, this problem was a bit of a headache. He could not just insta-kill several mecha on the battlefield and then wait to be beaten to death, or wait awkwardly for his subordinates or allies to come to his rescue. How could he solve this problem? Sulu narrowed his eyes and stared at his slightly pale self in the mirror, unable to find any answers. Perhaps he could go and ask that old master, or perhaps Li Feng, and perhaps he could find the root of the uncle's strange ability. However, the old master was too high up in the hierarchy, and Madman Li did not have a good impression of himself. The hot fog in the bathroom was gradually sucked in from the ceiling, and the air returned to normal. Sulu turned on the cold water and slowly rubbed his face. He calmed his heart and forcibly suppressed this hidden danger in the deepest part of his heart. After a moment of silence, like a psychic, he opened his mouth slightly and silently said to the depths of his brain, "Old thing, help me keep an eye on Zhong Ziqi's movements." The battle was in full swing. The Federal Central Computer was responsible for the specific calculation and suggestion process of the front lines. Because he was afraid of disturbing the Central Computer's intense work, he had not taken the initiative to contact that great being for a long time. However, this time, he had to make an exception. A string of pure white characters flashed across his left eye. Sulu held the sync with both hands and lowered his head in silence. As long as the old thing kept an eye on Zhong Erlang's movements, he believed that he would not have the opportunity to disturb Jian Shuier. Walking out of the bathroom, Bai Yulan, who had been waiting outside the door, handed him a soft cotton towel. Sulu rubbed his wet hair hard and asked, "The Department of Defense still hasn't planned to come?" They had been in the Venus Hotel for 2 days, and the surrounding reporters had already retreated out of boredom. However, the Department of Defense had not issued any new orders to this wonderful team. Bai Yulan shook her head and walked to the window to make a cup of tea. Group 7, along with Su Lu and Secretary Bai, a total of 20 combatants, were very clear that they had to stay in the West Woods to carry out the special orders of the Department of Defense. However, this order had not arrived for a day, and they had no confidence in their hearts. Su Lu took the teacup and said thank you. Bai Yulan looked at him and suddenly said, the person in the villa in Qiuming Mountain is the young master of the Li family. Su Lu had just sat down on the sofa and was silent for a moment when he heard this. Li Xiuzhu, the heir of the Li family, was pursuing Jian Shui'er. Of course, this was a top secret to the general public. However, Group 7 had been responsible for protecting Jian Shui'er for so long, so they were very clear about this matter. The question was, what did this have to do with him? Bai Yulan leaned against the window, lowered her head and whispered softly, there probably won't be any problems between you and Zhang Xiaomeng, but, what about Minister Zhou's daughter? I don't know the truth, but if someone wants to do something, maybe this will be a problem. Su Li's thick eyebrows rose. He understood what Bai Yulan was trying to remind him of. Most likely, in everyone's eyes, the nation's maiden had already cast her heart on him. Although he knew that was not the truth, he could not stop those who cared about him from caring. He didn't know what to say or how to handle the situation. He didn't even know what kind of joke Zhou Yu's extremely beautiful wife would play with the reporters after being bored in the snowstorm in Linhai province. He didn't even know what kind of joke Zhou Yu's extremely beautiful wife would play with the reporters to mock the existence of the nation's maiden, so he put down his teacup and stood up. He told Bai Yulan honestly, I'm going to repair the mecha. Bai Yulan was stunned, but then obediently took out the black workbench box and followed behind him, walking towards the heavily guarded underground warehouse of the hotel, after an entire night. The iris mark has been confirmed. Bai Yulan rubbed her sore eyes, looked at the miniature screen in her hand, and nodded. Then she raised her head to look at the tall black MX mecha by the wall and said softly. Standing outside the cockpit of the mecha, Su Lu, who was in the middle of a data connection, whistled softly. Then he frowned and looked into the distance. Because at the entrance of the warehouse, a group of military officers was walking in. Lieutenant Colonel Su Lu. A major general wearing the uniform of the West Woods military looked warmly at the young man in the mecha. Su Lu nodded. Because of your outstanding performance during the victorious military operation, the Department of Defense has awarded you the Purple Gold Medal Level 2. The Major General took out a medal from the box of his subordinate beside him and smiled at him, who had just climbed down from the mecha. He lowered his voice and said, you also know that this is a secret operation, so the award can only be done in secret. Su Lu lowered his head and looked at the glittering medal on the left side of his military uniform. He silently thought that he had already received a Purple Star Medal, the highest grade Purple Dawn Medal, and now he had received a Purple Gold Medal. However, besides the lowest grade Purple Star, it seemed that the rest of the medals could only be left at home to admire. This situation was a little unpleasant. As if guessing what he was thinking, the Major General of the West Woods military reminded him, at least on the surface of your exclusive mecha, you can paint 10 gold stars. Destroying an Empire mecha was equivalent to painting a gold star. This was the greatest glory of the Federation's mecha warriors. Su Lu was slightly stunned, and then he realized that his battle record on 5460 had already been confirmed by the Department of Defense. Before he could say anything, Bai Yulan, who was standing at the foot of the mecha behind him, had already thrown away the cigarette in her mouth. She smiled and raised the blowtorch in her hand, and began to carefully and attentively paint the gold stars one by one. Perhaps at the same time, on the front line of the faraway West Woods, on the fallen administrative planet filled with black fog and sky full of anti-aircraft artillery fire, between the mournful forest and the wild wilderness, on the rocky mountain in front of the largest landing base built by the Federal Army, the latest model of the Federation's Black MX was slowly retracting its blood-stained alloy chain knife. The base had just repelled a wave of the Empire's ferocious assault, and countless soldiers were staring at the Black MX with fervent and worshipful gazes. This was because in the previous battle, this MX had ruthlessly and incomparably destroyed 11 Empire's mechs. The engineering mechas started to hum as they repaired the metal base. The medics focused on sticking the wounds of the injured soldiers on the medical table. However, all of these people would occasionally raise their heads to look at the gap in the setting sun. The eyes of the Federation soldiers were filled with shock, admiration, fanaticism, and so on. The dense missile attack from the Imperial Expeditionary Force had blown up a gap in the northwest corner of the base. The mechas from the Black Sang Alliance were like a black dragon, roaring as they tried to charge in through the gap. The sound of metal colliding with the ground was so clear that it was shocking. Right at the most dangerous moment, the arrogant black mecha that was painted full of golden stars led its mecha battalion to the gap. The moment it arrived, it stood there, not willing to retreat even an inch of ground. It was like a steel wall that couldn't be moved by the wind or broken by the waves. The black mecha that seemed to have some kind of magical power attacked, dodged, and shot crazily. It was so strong that it actually blocked the Empire's mecha group. Every time an Empire mecha was destroyed and an Empire pilot was killed, a shining golden star could be painted on one's mecha. If an Empire mecha was completely destroyed, but the Empire pilot in the cockpit survived, then the outer line of the golden star would have to be a virtual line. This was an unspoken but extremely powerful habit of the Federal Army of the 37th Constitutional Era. In the countless smoke-filled front lines of the West Woods, proud mecha warriors could often be seen bathing in the sun, showing off the eye-catching golden stars on their mecha. This was a very direct display of battle results. The more golden stars on a mecha, the more battle achievements the owner of the mecha had. Most of the Federation pilots would think of ways to cover up the golden stars on the surface of their mecha when they were on a real battlefield. This was because the more golden stars on a mecha, the more Empire pilots they had killed. When the Empire soldiers saw these mecha with many golden stars on the battlefield, it was as if they had seen their nemesis who had killed their father, stolen their wife, and white face. They would have a desperate urge to kill no matter the cost. The Federation pilots would not be afraid, but they also did not want to be confused and wrongly killed by an absolutely wasteful missile attack from the Empire because of pride. In the past 20 years, there were not many mechas who dared to step onto the battlefield with a body full of stars, arrogance, and disdain for the Empire's fiery gazes and focused attacks. This was like a completely naked young girl rushing into a military camp that had not seen a sow for 3 years. It was too dangerous, so dangerous that there was a terrifying possibility of being ravaged at any time. It was rumored that a certain commander surnamed Tian from the Special Mecha Brigade of the Westwoods military region was such an awesome person, and he was the only one who could survive the battlefield in such a flashy manner. And now there was another person who dared to stand in the twilight with golden stars all over his body, coldly looking at the Empire mecha without retreating even half a step. Because he was the grandson of the god of war, he was Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng. Because he was the young madman who was said to be invincible in the military. In a dark corner of the base, the cockpit of the heavy black mecha slowly opened with the sound of jets. Li Feng jumped down and heavily patted the thick and cold mechanical legs of the mecha. He did not even look at the 3 exclusive mechanics who surrounded him and walked into the temporary base with a dark face. The black mecha behind him was painted with golden stars all over its body, like blooming flowers. It was still very eye-catching in the dark, and for a moment, it was impossible to count how many golden stars there were. Uncle Zhong, I'm a soldier. My mission is to fight at the front lines. Li Feng's body was tall and sturdy like a big tree. His handsome face had a hint of childishness, but there was more arrogance between his eyebrows. He frowned and said into the communicator, I'll be careful of my own safety, but I can't leave Chilin. The war in Chilin was very dangerous. Although he was the strongest warrior on the front lines of the West Woods in recent years, he also had a well-known identity. That identity gave him the right to maintain a secret connection with the highest commander on the front lines of the Space Fleet as a battalion commander of a mecha battalion. However, this identity also made this mecha prodigy feel a little suffocated, because none of his direct superiors dared to put him at the front lines, the most dangerous place, to let the only grandson of the god of war die in his own army, and possibly let the Lees of Philadelphia die without descendants. Who dared to bear this responsibility and the anger of hundreds of millions of people in the Federation? Only Commander Zhong, the true tiger of the West Woods, dared to use Madman Li. However, even he, after personally witnessing the fierce battle on the planet's surface, seeing the scene of Madman Li's mecha almost being annihilated by the crazed mecha of the Empire, also had the thought of transferring him back to space. Turning off the communicator, Li Feng pressed his thin, rosy lips together, wanting to laugh but habitually remaining silent and cold. Only Commander Zhong dared to use him under great pressure, daring to send him to a truly dangerous frontline. He was very clear on this point, so he was very grateful to this uncle who took care of him and watched over his youth on the battlefield. Ever since he was sent to the front lines by the old man when he was 12 years old, he had always lived in the Zhong family's mansion at number 36 Latitude 2 District. From a certain perspective, he was single-handedly trained by that tiger of the Zhong family. However, this was something that even his biological father, who was the dean of number 1 hospital, might not have a deep understanding of. In the Chiolin landing base, which covered an area of 7 square kilometers, the most important thing was the large transport ship landing platform. The Federation soldiers on the base were bathed in blood as they faced the attacks of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. They didn't even have the time to close their eyes, so naturally, they didn't care about any basic necessities. However, Madman Li was special after all. He had his own room and a bathroom with recycled water. Letting the cold underground water wash his tired body, Li Feng lowered his head and leaned against the wall, his body slightly trembling. After so many consecutive days of extreme fighting, his iron-like body felt that it was reaching its limit. In the water, the muscles on the young lieutenant colonel's strong body were well defined. Every muscle seemed to contain an inhuman explosive power, which looked extremely exaggerated. Compared to his body, his head seemed a bit small. After taking a shower, he looked at the time and confirmed that there were still 20 minutes left. Without hesitation, he took out his own pressure box, connected it to the power source, and stuck the electrode to his naked skin. The electric current flowed into the young man's body. He let out a muffled groan. Sweat poured down like a waterfall. The endless pain stimulated the thick veins and blood vessels to the point that they were about to drill out of the copper paper-like skin. Every muscle in his body began to be passively squeezed and rubbed. The pain and soreness followed a certain path and continued to extend. Since he was very young, Madman Li had been practicing like this. If he didn't have the willpower to endure the rare pain in this world, how could he obtain the rare power in this world? How could he paint his mecha with dazzling golden stars? He was like this, and so was Su Lu. Those with great willpower were bound to achieve great things. Chapter 438. The reason why Su Lu lived so bitterly and persistently was very simple. It was because he wanted to live. He wanted to widen his small eyes and see all the injustices in this world, so that it would be convenient for him to dig up and kick at any time. And the reason why the youthful and violent Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng lived so bitterly was not only because of his own so-called ideals, but more so because he had to maintain the glory of his family. He was the only son of the Lees of Philadelphia. When he came to the military camp at a young age, his life on the battlefield was already fixed within a certain range. He could die, but he could not lose, and he could not escape. The powerful pulse current was like countless small knives scraping at his periosteum and teasing his muscle fibers. The soreness, pain, and bitterness reached a terrifying level. However, this kind of extreme physiological stimulation allowed him to more clearly grasp the traces of the mysterious power in his body, and also allowed his brain to become clearer. Li Feng sat by the bed in silence, numb. His body trembled violently. Blood seeped out from the corners of his thin lips. That pair of eyes that were usually full of violence had a few drops of tears. After all, it was still painful. After all, he was not a real steel body. After all, he was only a young man who had not yet reached 18 years of age. However, the pain and weakness would always be in his own private quarters, in the darkness. When the time was up, the pulse current equipment in the press box automatically shut down. The young lieutenant colonel took a deep breath and wiped away the slight wetness at the corner of his eyes. An expression of self-loathing appeared on his face. The strongest young pilot in the Federation knew very well that he had absolute talent in mecha piloting. However, it was a pity that he did not completely inherit his grandfather's ability in cultivation. He stared blankly at his thick and strong arms, looking at the strong muscles under the copper skin. He thought to himself that the abnormal ability of his family in cultivation seemed to be getting weaker and weaker as his bloodline faded. In fact, his father, Director Li Jiedu, did not feel anything in this aspect at all. That mysterious power was the true reason why the god of war Li Pifu had never lost a battle. It was also the reason why the Lis of Philadelphia were proud of the world and looked coldly at the 7 great families. If all the soldiers of the Federation could learn this ability, then what were the people of the Empire? However, Li Feng knew very well that this was impossible. If he had not been stimulated by the electric current since he was a child, perhaps he would not have been able to find the burning power in the deepest part of the human body like his grandfather. He vaguely knew that there were some truly powerful pilots in the Empire's royal family who also possessed some extremely powerful abilities. However, there were very few of them, and they were of noble status. They had to stay on Tianjing planet to protect the royal family. Therefore, as the strongest warrior in the Federation, he did not have the chance to see them. Thinking of this, Li Feng's eyes burst out with a trace of light. His lips were tightly pursed, and the air around his body condensed, giving birth to a strong fighting spirit. Those true experts of the Empire, that princess of the Empire who was rumored to be as talented as him, who had reached level 6 at such a young age. Could she stand a chance? The air defense alarm in the Chilin base sounded. He looked out of the window, and the light in his eyes gradually faded, turning into some kind of doubt. At this moment, he thought of a person. He had to pay such a huge price to learn the secret martial arts passed down in his family. His uncle. How did he manage to teach that guy? Thinking of Sulu, Li Feng's emotions became somewhat complicated. He stood up and began to tidy up his military uniform. He was silent, but in his heart, he was a little envious of that guy's story all these years. That guy was not a professional soldier, so he could do whatever he wanted. This freedom to do whatever he wanted was so enviable. Up to this point, Li Feng had long wanted to kill Sulu, not because he called him uncle, not because of the legendary uncle, and not because of the relationship between Auntie Muzi and Sulu. It was because of a feeling called hypocrisy. After all, in the universe of the Federation, only the two of them had certain abilities and secrets. However, Li Feng thought of the words his grandfather had said in Qingqing prison. He couldn't help but frown and shake his head. Dragging the suitcase, he pushed open the door and walked toward the black mecha painted with golden stars. While Madman Li was being tortured and then thinking and preparing for war with doubts, Sulu was also thinking and preparing for war with doubts and then being tortured. He stared at the hundreds of soldiers scattered around the military camp. Those two thick, knife-like eyebrows of his finally couldn't help but furrow. He didn't understand why the Department of Defense would throw this dog shit in his face. He also didn't know if this was the arrangement of his convenient father-in-law, Minister Zhou, or the old man's sudden idea. The existence of him and the 20 men of Team 7 at the front line was somewhat strange. Nominally, they were mercenaries under Nutshell Company, but Sulu, the leader, was an active duty lieutenant colonel of the General Assembly Base. Even the West Woods Military District couldn't give them orders. They directly received orders from the Department of Defense of the Federation. However, this latest order from the Department of Defense was really a bit of a mess. Just a long trip on a warship and they're so tired that they're paralyzed like dogs. I'm not a professional soldier, but I know that this kind of unit can't be considered to have any combat power. How do you think I can lead them? Also, is there something wrong with the heads of the Department of Defense? Training these guys on the battlefield will only kill them. How can they be turned into steel? Can I not accept this? Major Lan Xiaolong, who was usually sharp-tongued, was especially silent today. This was because he was the only active duty officer of the 83-84 Division in Group 7. Looking at these old soldiers smoking, chatting, cursing, and even picking their feet, he felt very embarrassed. He smiled bitterly. It should be known that Su Lu had always been very good at controlling his emotions. But today, he was so angry that he said such a long paragraph. This was very telling. Bai Yulan put away the electronic notebook and looked at the soldiers in front of him. Even he couldn't help but say coldly, how did the division become like this? He was also a member of the 17th Division. Lan Xiaolong shrugged and sighed. Although the garrison officers are very happy to be in Port City every day, their combat power and discipline shouldn't be so bad. According to my understanding, the people sent by the Department of Defense this time are also the best of the 83-84 Division. He took Bai Yulan's electronic notebook and pointed at it softly beside Su Lu. Especially these guys, including Song Xiang and Shi Peng, whom Yulan just mentioned, and a few others. As he spoke, Lan Xiaolong pointed at the soldiers in the barracks. The soldiers he pointed at had cold, arrogant, and provocative expressions. There was also a hint of anxiety and anger, as if they didn't care at all about what he was saying to the lieutenant colonel wearing sunglasses. What do you mean? Su Lu asked. Song Xiang, the son of the principal of Yue University. Shi Peng, the nephew of the deputy speaker of Xi'an. Lan Xiaolong replied seriously, among these 100 people, there is a son of a governor, 5 sons of state senators, and 2 sons of federation senators. I have to remind you, this is very difficult to deal with. Su Lu was stunned. He didn't expect that the young man who was smoking and cursing was the son of the old principal. He also didn't expect that the curly-haired young man who was sprawled out on the chair like a hooligan and looking at him with provocative eyes was the nephew of the deputy speaker of Xi'an. After a moment of silence, he looked at this group of real young masters with great backgrounds and asked. Is this the legendary old master soldier? Chapter 439. The weather in the West Woods was a little gloomy today. The air pressure in the camp and Su Li's voice were a little gloomy. Lan Xiaolong lowered his head slightly and laughed bitterly, tacitly agreeing to this unpleasant name. Behind the lazy old soldiers, there were 7 or 8 fellows with clearly different temperaments. These people were clearly not beaten down by the fatigue of the long journey, and were currently displaying their skills on the training equipment, as well as the exaggerated bulging muscles of every part of their bodies. These people played with the heavy training equipment vigorously as they coldly stared at Su Lu and the members of Team 7 in front of the crowd. Although their nostrils were not blowing white smoke into the air, their unruly and slightly provocative gazes were enough to show that these strong soldiers were howling in the depths of their hearts, preparing to do something to pass the time. Looking over there through his sunglasses, Su Lu narrowed his eyes and asked, "Then where are these guys from? Are they bodybuilders from the Ministry of National Defense?" "They are also from our 17th Division." Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said, "The sons of the big shots love to enter the 17th Division, but after all, this is the division that the old man single-handedly brought up, so the Ministry of National Defense still picked out a few elites and stuffed them in. It's 8,384. Bai Yulan softly interjected from the side. It was obvious that this delicate but deeply incisive man was absolutely unwilling to admit that these old soldiers or those muscle-bound idiots in front of him were the juniors of his division. Lan Xiaolong ignored him and looked at Su Lu and said, "These guys are specially used to represent the division in the various assessments of the Ministry of National Defense. Now, the 17th Division is relying on these people to make a name for themselves. Plus, no one is controlling them, so these guys are a little arrogant and irritable. Yes, they know me, otherwise they would have already made a scene by now. If they were not old soldiers with great backgrounds, then they were undisciplined soldiers." Su Lu suddenly felt that his eyebrows were a little itchy. He reached out his right index finger and lightly scratched it. Looking around the camp, to everyone's surprise, he turned and walked back to his room without saying a word. The 100 or so soldiers from the 17th Division couldn't help but feel a little surprised when they saw the lieutenant colonel, who was obviously their highest-ranking officer, turn around and leave just like that. There wasn't a storm of reprimanding as they had expected. Song Xiang, who was slumped in his chair, had long prepared himself to be scolded by his superior and then take advantage of the situation to cause trouble. Who would have thought that all his psychological preparations would hit a wall of silence? Instead, he felt a little uncomfortable from being stifled, and his slumped posture became a little stiff. Other than the 4 major military academies in the Federation, Yue University had the deepest relationship with the military. It was the only school that had the right to conduct mecha education. As the only son of a principal, he had been given preferential treatment ever since he joined the military. Otherwise, he would not have dared to act like this, not giving his superior any face. What the hell is going on? All I know is that we are on the front line in the West Woods, but why are we here? What kind of troop was this? When can we go back? He asked his companion Shi Peng angrily. Shi Peng was the nephew of the vice-chairman of the Federation Management Committee. Logically speaking, any secret transfer by the Ministry of Defense should not have escaped his eyes. However, at this moment, this young master's face was also filled with confusion and resentment. This batch of 100 or so old soldiers were actually feeling abnormally depressed, angry, and confused at this moment. Otherwise, they would not have purposely acted in such a disrespectful manner when their superior called them out. Because they had no idea why the Ministry of Defense would send soldiers like them from the garrison district to the terrifying and bloody front line. About half a month ago, these soldiers of Unit 83-84, who had been living a life of drunkenness in the outskirts of the port city, were suddenly urgently transferred to the military spaceport by their superiors. At the same time, all of their communication devices were confiscated. Then, they inexplicably boarded a warship, and after more than 10 days of dizzying high-speed space travel, they arrived in the West Woods in a daze. "I want to go back." Shi Peng gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "When I find a phone, I'll call Uncle immediately." Is the Ministry of Defense crazy? Sending us to the front line, don't they know that people will die here? In the past tens of thousands of years, the status of the military in the Federation society had never been high, because the Federation did not have any powerful enemies in the universe. At that time, the political structure of the society, other than the Supreme Court of the Federation, was mainly the checks and balances of the Federation government, the Management Committee, and the 7 families hidden in the shadows of history. However, with the appearance of the Empire's invaders, after countless crushing defeats, tragic victories, and life-and-death situations, the status of the federal military was blown by the wind and skyrocketed in the short span of 60 years. Whether it was the lofty image in the hearts of the hundreds of millions of people in the Federation, or the needs of survival in reality and political needs, it all made the military the most special and important part of the Federation society. Through some unknown means, they had obtained the personnel list of certain military logistics units and published it through the Capital Special District Daily. The people of the Federation were shocked and angry to find that these logistics units that did not need to go to the front lines were actually filled with the descendants of Federation politicians and rich people. In the email, Zhou Yu used a very sarcastic tone to mock the big shots of the Federation. She did not even spare her own father, because the current Federation Minister of Defense was actually the real head of logistics for the Federation in recent years. Under the full suppression of the Federation government and the upper echelons of society, this news was suppressed. However, President Pabre ordered the Department of Defense to conduct a sample investigation. He angrily instructed that they must find out whether the danger level of the Federal Army was inversely proportional to its wealth. Perhaps it was because of this background, or because the old man in Philadelphia could not bear to see the current state of the 17th Division anymore. That was why there was this space trip that frightened and angered the young masters, and that was why there was this scene in the West Woods military camp today. The soldiers of the common people were sacrificing their lives on the front lines in the West Woods, while the young masters of these big shots were hiding in the suburbs of Harbor City, leading a drunken life. After reading this email, Su Li's narrowed eyes did not become cold, but instead calmed down. He had long known that the Federation had collapsed to a certain extent, but he did not expect that some of the big shots would try to use him as a knife to cut the rotten meat. In his silence, he did not notice that Zhou Yu had used an angry emoticon at the end of the email to ask the hooligan to stop harassing her. Su Li walked out of the room and came to the military camp under the gloomy sky. Chapter 440. Su Li looked at the people in front of him through his sunglasses. His expression was calm and composed. Compared to these young masters of the upper class, he was just an orphan from Donglin. He was born poor, and it was impossible for him to have a golden spoon or precious jade in his mouth when he was born. However, he had great strength and a strong backbone. In his mind, he had always been entangled with the oldest and greatest old man in human society. Even when facing the revered god of war, Li Pifu, he could still stiffen his neck and remain composed. Showing a sense of superiority in front of him? That was a joke. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth and said to the people in front of him. Perhaps many of you are still wondering why the Department of Defense sent you to the West Woods. In fact, I am also very puzzled by this question. Because I don't know where to start training you. You are just a pile of dirt. Even if you are smelted in a high-temperature furnace for a few years, you will only become brittle and useless ceramic pieces. It is impossible for you to become the steel material that the army truly needs. The material you are made of determines your possibilities. If you are a pile of dog shit and pee your pants after going to the front line because of the Empire's roaring bullets, then you will become a pile of diluted shit. If you stick to the pants of our Group 7, it will make me very uncomfortable and very angry. In the S1 training base, Su Lu, who wore sunglasses, had already played the role of a cold instructor many times. He was already very familiar with this set of actions. Those truly outstanding people of the Federal Army had all turned red under his harsh humiliation. They were angry and irritable. Not to mention this group of old soldiers from the 17th Division in front of him, this group of young masters who had never been humiliated like this in their lives. Dog shit was still diluted. Dirt could not be smelted into steel. The soldiers listened to these extremely humiliating words and looked at the taunting and bullying of the lieutenant colonel at the front of the line, whose face was mostly covered by sunglasses. Their expressions had already become extremely ugly. Many people showed resentment in their eyes. Some people began to discuss with gloomy expressions. Su Lu ignored these obvious violations of discipline. He looked down at the list in the electronic notebook and said, "But since the Ministry of National Defense has handed you over to me, and since Mr. President trusts me, I have to do something. To tell you the truth, in 10 days, we will be parachuting to Planet 163 to carry out an extremely risky mission. Believe me, after this mission is completed, the chances of you surviving are not high." Apart from a few powerful ruffians, most of the soldiers' expressions changed drastically. If it was said that Su Li's previous words had made them angry, then the revealed mission made them feel endless fear. Su Li wasn't lying. According to the analysis in Zhou Yu's email, the Federation government had to do something in order to silence the George Carlin faction and the Green Dragon Mountain faction that was preparing to take advantage of the situation. Regardless of whether it was because of his anger or because he wanted to appease the anger of the people, President Parable had to let these people go to the real front lines and accept the real test of blood and fire. And he was the sword in President Parable's hand. Recognizing this fact clearly, Sulu didn't feel too heavy or angry. He had always admired Pabre, what Mr. Sher called his own president. This president had rescued him from prison. The president had always displayed a moral integrity that was completely different from the politicians. The president was an exception in the political history of the Federation. He was an exception that deserved the sincere protection of people like Sulu, so he was willing to work hard to complete the mission given by the president. As for the sons of these important figures in the Federation, if they wanted to live, they had to change their attitude towards life. If they died, Sulu believed that he wouldn't have too many tears to shed. He looked at the few powerful ruffians in the back of the crowd who didn't hide their cold, arrogant, and wild expressions. His brows furrowed. These bodybuilders of the 17th Division looked as cold and callous as Du Shaoqing's soldiers, but they hadn't learned the iron 7th Division's sense of discipline at all. It was truly a bit annoying. Yan Bingyan, Lu Qingsong. He called out the names of those people and said, "You guys stay here. The rest of you start running laps until I tell you to stop." This was an order to half disperse. At this moment, the soldiers who had fallen into shock, panic, and anger didn't follow the order to run. Instead, they stared at Sulu with eyes that were about to spit fire, as if they wanted to melt the cold sunglasses on his face. "We're not going," someone shouted loudly. Shiping said coldly, "We demand freedom of communication." The son of another senator shouted angrily, "Why do we have to go to the front lines? Since when can the garrison area fight in a foreign land? You have to give us an explanation, or else we want the Ministry of Defense to give us an explanation." As soon as the son thought of going to war with those beast-like Empire people, his face turned pale with fright. He pulled at his hair in pain, completely unable to understand what was happening before his eyes. He couldn't inform his father, family, or girlfriend. Did he have to go to the front lines in such a muddled manner? Under the influence of all kinds of emotions, the crowd began to become agitated. They protested loudly and angrily. They had no intention of leaving at all. Instead, they surrounded Sulu and the members of the 7th Division. They were not real soldiers of the Federation in the first place. Suddenly realizing that they were about to face an iron-blooded war, the desire to survive, the fear of being forgotten, and the hatred for Su Li's attitude mixed together and turned into a kind of tide of excitement. Bai Yulan glanced at Su Lu, using her gaze to ask if they needed to suppress him. Su Lu shook his head, used his index finger to push up his sunglasses, and walked towards the back of the crowd. The old soldiers didn't run laps after disbanding, and those few strong soldiers he had named also didn't stay behind as ordered. Instead, they returned to the training equipment without any discipline. They began to flex their muscles again, silently and disdainfully spraying the smell of hormones as a silent demonstration and protest. The heavy training equipment collided continuously, producing dull metallic sounds. The muscular men in the tight singlets were drenched in sweat. They looked at the approaching Su Lu, but had no intention of getting up at all. Among them, the second lieutenant named Yan Bingyan looked at Su Lu provocatively with a mocking smile, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. His smile wasn't sunny at all, but fierce and ruthless. Yan Bingyan, the 17th Division's record holder for many training events in the past 3 years. For this monster, running 10 kilometers with weights was as easy as taking a stroll. Right now, the weight displayed on the electronic positioning weight training equipment he was using had already reached its peak, but he was still able to easily reveal a hint of mockery in his smile. When the soldiers beside the training equipment heard that they were going to the front lines, they weren't as panicked as the old soldiers. Instead, they were faintly excited. It was just that they were used to being undisciplined in Hong Kong, and more importantly, they were a little aggrieved by the National Defense Department's ruthless methods, and angered by Su Li's attitude, so they were exceptionally tough. I didn't ask you to stay behind to train with these weights. Su Li looked at the guys beside the equipment and said, are you kids who want to play? Or are you guys male prostitutes who specialize in bodybuilding and then flirt with rich ladies? Otherwise, why can't you leave these things for even a moment? With a muffled thud, Yan Bingyan came down from the equipment with an ashen face. The heavy weight landed heavily on the receiver, and the steel handle, which was about 3 fingers thick, shook up and down. The rest of the strong men also came down from the equipment and stood behind Yan Bingyan, coldly looking at Su Lu and the people behind him. Sir, I think it's best to take back those words. Yan Bingyan stared into his eyes and said, of course I don't dare to threaten you, but to say that the equipment used by the military is the means of a male prostitute, I feel that this is an unacceptable humiliation. Of course, you may not be good at these things. Yan Bingyan looked at him with a hint of mockery, but I think that no matter what army, the strong should always receive a certain amount of respect. Very good, respect the strong. At least we have one thing in common. Su Lu looked at him and suddenly said, De Xiong, let this strong man try holding your weapon. As the gunner of Group 7, Xiong Linquan's strength was unparalleled. Even in the entire federal military, he could be ranked at the forefront. Hearing this, Bai Yulan and the others instantly understood what the supervisor wanted to do, and their lips curled up slightly. Initially, Xiong Linquan had been the one who disliked Su Lu the most, but after interacting with him in the training base, after graduating from the Japanese academy, he had become the one who admired Su Lu the most. After hearing the order, he ran back without hesitation. Half a minute later, he carried his favorite weapon. The strong men beside the training equipment looked at the heavy Darlin rotary cannon in Xiong Linquan's hands, and their expressions turned ugly. In the Federation's military camp, there were many fierce people who could use the Darlin rotary cannon, which was specially used for mecha and fighter jets. In fact, every one of them could be said to be a legend, but this guy in front of them was actually carrying it so easily. Could this really be his standard weapon? Don't force yourself, said Xiong Linquan sincerely as he carefully handed the heavy machine gun in his hands to Yan Bingyan. Of course, he wouldn't sympathize with the guy in front of him, wondering if his wrist would break with a snap. He was only worried that this seemingly tough guy would break the equipment he used to make a living. Yan Bingyan's expression was ugly, but also serious and stubborn. He took a deep breath, and the muscles on his arms bulged as he took the Darlin rotary cannon. Being able to lift the Darlin rotary cannon with one hand showed that this ace soldier of the 17th Division indeed had extraordinary strength. However, his face was slightly red, and his right shoulder was trembling. If he wanted to use the Darlin rotary cannon to shoot everywhere on the battlefield, it would obviously be impossible. From this point of view, he was much weaker than Xiong Linquan. 2 seconds later, Xiong Linquan snatched the Darlin rotary cannon away, shook his head, and turned to leave. Yan Bingyan's face was still red. Other than using too much strength, he was more embarrassed. However, he wasn't convinced, because in the military camp, strength wasn't everything. Su Lu didn't need to look at the strong man's expression to know what he was thinking. He extended his hand to Bai Yulan and said, "Give me your uniform." Bai Yulan took off his uniform without hesitation. Su Lu walked over to the weight training apparatus that Yan Bingyan had previously used to train, and carefully rolled up Bai Yulan's uniform onto the pure steel handrail. He glanced at the maximum weight value displayed on the apparatus, and knew that it was left behind by Yan Bingyan. He remained silent. Everyone present thought that he was going to show off his strength. The men of Group 7 began to shrug their shoulders, but Yan Bingyan and the people behind her had a suspicious look on their faces. They always felt that although this lieutenant colonel was a little too young, it was impossible for him to have so much strength just by looking at his body. Chapter 441. There was a very soft cracking sound. Almost at the same time, there were two more cracking sounds, so that most of the people present did not hear the first sound. Only Su Lu knew that it was definitely not the sound of his own metacarpal bones breaking. There was a large hole in the right armpit of his military uniform. The layers of By Magnolia's military uniform that were wrapped around the steel armrest were also torn into two pieces. Su Lu retracted his palm and lowered his head to look at the damage on his right armpit. He said to By Magnolia, who was beside him, with a bitter smile, "Both uniforms seem to be damaged." By Magnolia nodded and did not say anything. However, she was just as shocked as the people around her. She and the men of Team 7 had long been accustomed to Su Li's extraordinary strength. Of course, they knew that his palm strike was not just for the two uniforms. His target must have been the pure steel armrest wrapped under the uniforms. The problem was, that was a pure steel armrest that was nearly 3 fingers thick. Su Lu had chopped it with his bare hand. Did he really think that his palm was made of super alloy? Although Bai Yulan and the other members of Group 7 had absolute faith in Su Li's abilities, they still couldn't hide their shock when they saw this scene. They were even more curious about what had become of the pure steel armrest under the tattered military uniform. Yan Bingyan and those bodybuilders did not understand the shock on these people's faces. They stared at Su Lu. They did not understand why this young lieutenant colonel would do such a thing. Could it be that he had a hobby of smashing iron with his own flesh? Su Lu looked at Yan Bingyan and these people and said calmly, "The training I have arranged for you is to stand at attention for 4 hours. After that, you will have to do marching and formation training. Because of your serious lack of discipline, even I, a guy who has been in the army for less than a year, can't stand it anymore. The training program will start in 5 minutes." Yan Bingyan snorted and was about to say something, but Su Lu ignored her and said, "You said that the strong should be respected. As long as you can do what I just did, I'll allow you the freedom to practice bodybuilding every day." Yan Bingyan and the others were stunned. They didn't understand what he was trying to say. However, at this time, Su Lu and the members of Group 7 had already left the equipment area. Lan Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan couldn't help but look back at the military uniform wrapped around the steel armrest. Their eyes were filled with intense curiosity and excitement. It was precisely because of these gazes that the valiant soldiers beside the apparatus could not help but turn their heads to look at the weight-bearing apparatus. The close combat expert named Lu Qingsong finally couldn't bear the strange silent atmosphere and the doubts in his heart. He stepped forward and tore off the military uniform wrapped around the armrest. As the last layer of military uniform was torn off, his right hand suddenly froze. Looking at that place, the expressions of the strong guys beside the equipment suddenly became extremely interesting. Yan Bingyan's pupils shrank, and her face revealed an expression of disbelief. The scene in front of her made her eyes twitch rapidly. The pure steel armrest about the thickness of 3 fingers was connected to the equipment at both ends, but the middle part was broken horizontally. The hard steel rod, at this time, looked like a soft and bleak willow branch. It seemed to be constantly shaking in the breeze of the military camp. A human hand broke a steel pipe, and it was the solid kind. Had such a scene appeared in the army before? Yan Bingyan and Lu Qingsong looked at each other with a pale face and saw the shock and fear in each other's eyes. These young masters firmly believed that as long as they let the elders of their families know what kind of humiliation and danger they were enduring, they would definitely have a way to interfere with this inexplicable and crazy action of the military. "Why don't you run laps?" Su Lu walked in front of them and asked, "You should know the rules of the military very well. I don't want to take measures to punish you on the first day." The young popinjays stared at him angrily and didn't say a word. They didn't see the scene that happened by the equipment just now, so they didn't know what kind of terrifying strength this lieutenant colonel with sunglasses had. On the contrary, they habitually used the ability to judge people that they had honed in the upper class of the capital ring to place most of their attention on Su Li's age. Through the wide sunglasses, they seemed to be able to confirm that this lieutenant colonel was very young. To become a high-ranking officer in the military at such a young age, this person definitely had a great background. It was unknown whether or not being transferred to the front line by the Ministry of Defense would involve some hidden storm in the political world. However, if it was a competition of family background, these popinjays definitely didn't need to admit defeat. Xi Peng didn't answer Su Li's question. With a gloomy face, he said, "We were kidnapped. Before we know the reason, I refuse to obey orders. At the very least, you should let us have the freedom of communication that every citizen and soldier should have. Why don't you run laps?" Su Li didn't seem to see this person's face. When he heard this person's words, his eyes were hidden behind the sunglasses as he asked in a soft and dull voice. Not getting any response, Xi Peng's face became even uglier. Instead of running, he slowly sat back down on the chair. He stretched out his hand and waved it in the air. A few people followed his lead and sat down in a bold and decisive manner. They wanted to embarrass Su Li and the men of Group 7 in front of the crowd without any words. After 10 seconds of suppressed silence and tension, no one answered Su Li's question that was repeated for the second time. He glanced at the popinjays who were sitting on the chairs, turned around, and whispered something to Bai Yulan. Bai Yulan's soft eyebrows instantly raised. Like the flowers in spring, there was a hint of awkwardness and solemnity in the gentleness. Hearing Su Li's order, even someone as cold as him felt a little surprised and troubled. These old soldiers in front of him were completely different from the bodybuilders beside the machines. Their fathers were all famous big shots in the Federation. Even the Ministry of Defense couldn't completely resist the pressure from these families. Group 7 was undoubtedly the best among the mercenaries, but when faced with the pressure from the capital ring and the anger of those big shots, they were just ordinary soldiers. How could they resist? Bai Yulan put his right hand into his trouser pocket. He knew very well that this matter involved President Pabre and the government of the Federation, or even the old man in Philadelphia. However, their target was the politicians and tycoons that made up the Federation. The matter seemed to be very complicated. However, the little boss's order was so simple. Bai Yulan's face was gloomy and uncertain. He deeply felt that his supervisor, this man named Su Li, seemed to be the best at simplifying complicated things. So he slowly walked forward. The popinjays sat on the chairs with cold expressions, humiliating Su Li's order. However, they looked at the handsome man who was getting closer and closer. They seemed to be able to feel a terrifying aura spreading. They couldn't help but feel a little confused and panicked. Xi Peng stared at Bai Yulan's right hand that was in his trouser pocket and asked, "What do you want to do?" Bai Yulan silently walked forward and took out the delicate military knife from his trouser pocket. Without any warning, the delicate military knife flashed with a beautiful light, cut through the air, and easily pierced into Xi Peng's right shoulder. With a puff, blood spurted out. Xi Peng didn't cry out in pain. His face was pale as he looked at the delicate knife on his right shoulder in shock. He seemed to be so shocked by this ridiculous scene that he didn't know what to say. Someone dared to stab me. That person stabbed me. Someone actually dared to stab me. A scream sounded. The popinjays looked at Xi Peng, who fell on the ground with pale faces and trembled. A few of the braver ones rushed over and hugged Xi Peng in their arms. At the same time, they glared at Bai Yulan and Su Li and screamed, "Are you crazy? If you don't listen to the order, you will also die if you go to 163. Su Li looked at the bleeding Xi Peng and naturally thought of the big shot that he had met at the flowing wind slope. He said softly, "I'll give you 1 more minute. If you still don't want to run laps, I don't mind letting this secretary Bai stab you 2 more times." Song Ji tightly hugged the bleeding Xi Peng. He was trembling with anger and fear. He stared at Su Li fiercely and shouted, I'm going to complain to the legal department. I'm going to send you to the military court. Sulu was silent for a moment and suddenly said, I forgot to tell you, this is the 7th Combat Team of the Shell Corporation. We are mercenaries, not federal forces. The military court can't control us. The Popinjays' faces were pale. Shi Peng was desperately covering his bleeding wound. He stared at Sulu and roared, Who the fuck are you? Lan Xiaolong, tell this son of a bitch who I am. Lan Xiaolong quietly hid behind Sulu. He glanced at the chaotic scene with the corner of his eyes. His heart slightly twitched. He really didn't understand why Sulu dared to do this. However, at least at this moment, he knew that the baby of the deputy speaker would definitely not be able to get back his face. Yan Bingyan and the other strong men beside the equipment in the distance had already begun to do standing training under the hot sun with ugly expressions. Sulu looked at these young masters who were gnashing their teeth in anger and fear. After a moment of silence, he took off the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose and said, I don't care who you are, but I think I should let you know who I am. He didn't care if his head would bleed, but he didn't care if he smashed a hole in the iron wall or only left a few traces of blood. He didn't care if he would break his head and bleed, but he didn't care if he smashed a hole in the iron wall or only left a few traces of blood. This kind of person was very frightening. A calm madman was even more frightening than the little madman Lees of Philadelphia. Even if Madman Lee dared to rush into Parliament Hill and start a fight, he definitely wouldn't dare to do such a thing. Based on the evaluation of this person in the upper circle, and the legendary death of a certain senator, Shi Peng, who was lying on the ground, couldn't help but feel cold all over as he looked at the calm and sincere officer in front of him. Even if the other party was smiling like a flower under the sun and was as calm as water, he could still smell the blood and see the demon's horns. The fact that Macklin was killed by Su Lu and Shi Qinghai together was one of the Federation's biggest secrets. However, as George Carlin once mockingly pointed out, the Federation's information was not equal. The so-called secrets were originally the fruits of the upper circle's harvest. Therefore, Shi Peng knew, and so did the sons of the governors and senators around him. Shi Peng's uncle was a senior senator of the Federation. The current deputy speaker, Shaun, was compared to Macklin, who had died at the hands of Su Lu. Perhaps because of his long experience in business, his hidden strength and connections were deeper and wider. However, on the surface, he couldn't compare to Macklin's once impressive reputation. It should be known that although Macklin had already withdrawn from the presidential election at that time, he wasn't the villain that was hated by the people today. He still had the support of the people, and the Federation's government and political circle, even terrifying existences like the 7 great families, had to make some kind of compromise. However, this guy in front of him just so unreasonably and brutally killed him. Su Lu even dared to kill Macklin at that time, let alone Shi Peng, who was only his uncle's nephew. Shi Peng's face was pale, and his eyes were wandering. However, he could still clearly feel the pain from the sharp wound on his right shoulder. He was more and more convinced that if he continued to resist, he was afraid that this delicate and feminine man would really stab him to death. After only 2 seconds of silence, Shi Peng tightly pursed his lips and climbed up from the ground with difficulty. He saluted Su Lu and then turned to walk toward the field. His strong will because of his family background, power, and money instantly collapsed and shattered in the face of the simplest and most direct shadow of blood and death. At least in this military camp, he had to endure, stall for time, and wait for his family's response. Su Lu lowered his head and looked at his watch, calculating the time. The foppish soldiers all turned pale and ran toward the field. Su Lu raised his head, put on his sunglasses again, and said a few words to the people behind him. The outstanding battlefield medic of Team 7, Ho Xiandong, immediately reacted and rushed to the field. He pulled Shi Peng to the shade and began to treat the wound on his shoulder. Bai Yulan's stab was not deep, but the wound was a little long and there was a lot of blood. It looked a little scary. They were the mercenaries of Nutshell Company and did not seem to have to worry about the existence of military discipline or military court. However, no matter how cold and silent Su Lu was, he would not stab his subordinates to death just because they did not attend training. Strangely, however, many people seemed to think that Su Lu was really a terrifying person who killed without batting an eyelid. The foppish soldier running toward the field was the last to follow the symbol. Su Lu called out to him. After a moment of silence, he said, "Don't embarrass the old principal." The symbol's face was covered in bruises and bruises. He did not know that his father was the principal of Yue University. At home, he often heard his father talk about the legend of this little gatekeeper in front of him. Su Lu had never received professional training in the military camp. He had never run weight-bearing training. He had only followed Bai Yulan for a period of time to learn about firearms and standard mecha operation. Those tactical manuals were also just his hobby reading, so naturally, he could not be responsible for the training of more than 100 subordinates. In fact, he did not understand these things. After confirming that the breath of these old soldiers had been completely suppressed, he put on his sunglasses and returned to his room. He began to use the military communication system to send frequent technical emails to Shang Qiu, who was far away in Hong Kong. During this period of time, the engineering department of Nutshell Company had begun to experiment with the turbine compression idea that Shang Qiu's Mr. Qing Fengshe had proposed. They were in a state of excitement and anxiety. The engineering department missed him very much, and he also missed the atmosphere of the past. Bai Yulan was fully in charge of the training, with Lan Xiaolong assisting. Those old soldiers with extremely poor military qualities were undergoing a horrendous training on the field. Xiong Linquan held a spiked leather boot and roared, forcing those people to move faster and faster. As long as someone slowed down or collapsed, a few whips would cut through the air, leaving behind a few bloody scars. Fortunately, the Department of National Defense was extremely generous to the point of being extravagant. Dr. Ho Xiandong skillfully and excitedly operated those medical pods, injecting all sorts of medicine into those old soldiers who had fainted from exhaustion. He could absolutely guarantee that these young masters would not be left with any physical injuries. Cured. Continue to train. But he still remained silent. Lan Xiaolong was silent for a moment. He turned his head and stared at the pair of slender eyes through the black hair. He said very seriously, "You keep insisting on calling him boss. Are you really going to sell your life to this guy? You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.